Welcome, welcome. You're here at Super Harry. Today we present to you, what if Hermione found love potions in Harry's food at age 11 and declared war on every family who used them? Like and subscribe if you want more awesome stories. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Chapter 1, The Taste of Something Wrong. The thing about Hermione Granger was that she never boarded anything without a book. She had 3 in her trunk, 2 in her bag, and 1, Magical Theory and Its Practical Discontents by Adeline Voss, wedged under her arm as she dragged her trolley down the platform at King's Cross, searching for carriage doors that weren't already jammed with students and owls and the general magnificent chaos of September the 1st. Her parents had already gone. There had been hugs, and her mother had cried a little, and her father had made a joke about finally having the bathroom to himself, and then they were gone and she was here, which was exactly where she wanted to be and also somehow slightly terrifying, though she would not have admitted the terrifying part to anyone. She found an empty compartment near the middle of the train and got her trunk up onto the rack by herself. It took 3 attempts and 1 strained shoulder, and then she sat down, opened her book, and told herself firmly that she was fine. She read 4 pages before she heard the commotion in the corridor. Not an argument. More like someone being moved through space against their general preference, which had a very specific acoustic quality, the shuffle of reluctant feet, the low murmuring of older students being performatively helpful in a way that was actually just condescending. Hermione looked up as the compartment door slid open and a boy half fell through it, clearly having been nudged in by someone who had since walked on. He was slight and messy-haired and wearing clothes that were technically clothes in the same way a tent is technically shelter, functional in the loosest possible sense, obviously someone else's. He had round glasses that sat crooked on his nose and a general air of someone who was used to not quite fitting wherever he was placed. He looked at Hermione. Hermione looked at him. "Sorry," he said. "Everywhere else is full, or they said it was full, or," he stopped. "Is it all right if I sit here?" "Yes," Hermione said, and then, because she couldn't help herself, "You're Harry Potter, aren't you?" It came out flatter than she meant it to, more like a statement of fact than an observation, which was accurate but perhaps not the warmest opening. The boy, Harry, did something complicated with his face that she would later learn meant "here we go." "Yeah," he said. "I've read about you." "Well, I've read about what people say about you, which isn't necessarily the same thing." She moved her bag off the seat across from her. "Sit down. I'm Hermione Granger." He sat down. His trunk was smaller than hers and had a crack in one corner that had been inexpertly fixed with what looked like parcel tape. On top of it sat a cage with a beautiful white owl inside, which regarded Hermione with a look of considerable self-possession. "Her name's Hedwig," Harry said, which was apparently something people asked about, because he said it immediately and unprompted. "She's lovely," Hermione said, and meant it, and then went back to her book. The train moved. Harry looked out the window. Hermione read. It was, she thought, a perfectly comfortable arrangement, the particular easy quiet of 2 people who didn't need to fill silence with noise. She appreciated that more than she would have expected to. 20 minutes out of London, someone knocked on the compartment door and slid it open without waiting for an answer, which Hermione found immediately irritating. It was a round-faced boy with an expression of such genuine distress that the irritation dissolved at once. "Have you seen a toad?" "Only I've lost him, his name's Trevor, and I've asked everyone and," the boy's voice cracked slightly at the edges. He had the look of someone who was already having a difficult day and knew it was going to get worse. "I haven't," Hermione said, "but we can help you look if you like." "What does he look like?" "Like a toad," Harry said, not unkindly. "He's brownish. Middling-sized." The boy swallowed. "My gran gave him to me." Hermione put her book away. "I'm Hermione." "That's Harry. What's your name?" "Neville," the boy said. "Neville Longbottom." They found Trevor 4 compartments down, sitting with great dignity on someone's abandoned copy of Which Broomstick. The someone turned out to be a red-haired boy with freckles who introduced himself as Ron Weasley and seemed far more interested in Harry than in the toad retrieval mission, which Hermione noted without comment. Harry handled it graciously. He seemed to have a practiced way of accepting attention that kept it from turning into a performance, a kind of quiet self-containment that she found unexpectedly interesting. Neville retrieved Trevor with a gratitude that was slightly disproportionate to the effort involved, clutched the toad to his chest, and looked at Hermione like she had personally returned something much more significant than an amphibian. She didn't know what to do with that, so she smiled and said, "Easy to lose things on first days," and let him wander back toward the compartment he'd come from. They went back to their own compartment. Ron Weasley followed, talking, and within 10 minutes had produced a large bag of sweets from some hidden pocket of his robes and was sharing them around with the particular energy of someone who had decided that the best way to establish friendship was through food. Harry took a chocolate frog. Ron explained the cards. Hermione watched them with the quiet, cataloging attention that was just how her mind worked, sorting Ron into categories: loud, kind, self-conscious about money, desperate to impress, and then she noticed the second bag. It was tucked into the corner of the seat, half under Harry's trunk, and it wasn't Ron's. The color was wrong, a dark green rather than the yellow of honeydukes. It was already open. Harry had apparently been eating from it before Ron arrived, before Hermione had even found the compartment. There was a small pile of wrappers near Harry's knee, 3 or 4 of them, twisted the way wrappers get when you've been eating absently while thinking about something else. Hermione's eyes went to them. Went away. Came back. She had read, in preparation for Hogwarts, read everything she could get her hands on, really, including practical potions and their detection by Sir Aldrich Humphrey, which was a dense and slightly tedious book that she had nevertheless read twice because it had a chapter on potion residue in food that she'd found conceptually fascinating. The chapter had included a smell test, an observation test, and a brief description of what common compulsion residue looked like on wrapper paper when the potion had been absorbed through contact: a faint shimmer, almost like oil but not quite, more like the way heat makes air move above asphalt in summer. The wrappers near Harry's knee had that shimmer. She didn't say anything immediately. That was important. She was not the kind of person who said things immediately when she needed to think first. She picked up her book again and she thought, and what she was thinking was, one wrapper could be a fluke. One could be a manufacturing fault or a contamination from something else in the bag. But 3 or 4, all with the same shimmer, all from the same green bag that no one has claimed. "Harry," she said, very calmly, "where did that bag come from?" He looked at the green bag like he'd forgotten it was there. "It was in my trunk when I packed. I thought my aunt might have." He stopped. "Actually, no. My aunt doesn't give me sweets." "Who packed your trunk?" "I did. And the bag was just in there." He frowned. "Weird, now that you say it. I just assumed someone had, I mean it seemed like it was meant to be there." He reached for another one and Hermione said, "Don't," sharply enough that both he and Ron looked at her. She was already out of her seat and crouching on the floor next to the bag, not touching it, her nose close but not too close, and she was looking at the wrappers. Up close the shimmer was unmistakable. It was faint, faint enough that you'd never see it if you weren't looking for it, if you hadn't memorized what it looked like from a diagram in a book, but it was there, that slow, oily iridescence on paper that had been in contact with a compulsion potion. She picked up one wrapper between 2 fingernails and held it up to the light from the window. "What are you doing?" Ron asked. "Being careful," Hermione said. She went back to her bag and found the small glass vial of detection solution she'd brought because she was Hermione Granger and she had read about detection solutions and decided to bring one the same way other people brought spare socks. It was a pale violet liquid and she had 2 of them, tucked in a padded pouch next to a spare quill. She uncapped one carefully and touched it to the corner of the wrapper. The liquid turned amber. Amber was compulsion. The next wrapper she tested turned amber too. The third turned amber. The fourth turned a deep, burnished gold that made her breath stop for a second because gold wasn't ordinary compulsion, gold was affection enhancement, which was a specific subcategory of love potion use, illegal for use on minors under the 1947 Magical Substances Act. Though in fairness to the law it was rarely enforced because love potion use on children was something that everyone politely pretended didn't happen. She sat back on her heels and for a moment she just looked at the vial and thought about what the gold meant. It meant someone had put not one but two different chemical compounds in Harry Potter's sweets. One that encouraged compliance, general agreeableness, a tendency to do what you were told without quite knowing why. And one that encouraged warmth toward specific people, which required a further primer to activate, which meant that somewhere there was either a second potion Harry had already consumed, or one that was waiting to be administered by whoever gave him the sweets in the first place. This had been planned. Hermione, Harry said, and his voice was very even, the way voices go when someone's heart rate has gone up but they're choosing not to show it. What's in those wrappers? She looked up at him. He was watching her with those green eyes behind the crooked glasses and he looked like someone who had just had the very small but significant suspicion that his whole life might have been slightly different from what he'd been told, confirmed in a way he hadn't quite expected. Potion residue, she said. She put the vials down on the seat beside her and she looked at him steadily. Compulsion traces. And something called an affection enhancer. Someone put them in these sweets before they put them in your trunk. The compartment went very quiet. Ron had stopped chewing. He was looking at the chocolate frog in his hand with a sudden and slightly panicked expression. Is mine, that's Honeydukes, Hermione said. Those are fine. This bag is different. Oh. He set it down anyway. Blimey. Harry hadn't moved. He was looking at the green bag and Hermione could see the arithmetic happening behind his eyes, going back through memories, recalculating things he'd written off as normal, trying to figure out when the bag might have been placed in his trunk and by whom, and more importantly, why. His expression was not frightened. It was the expression of someone getting quietly, comprehensively furious, and doing it very tidily. How long does this stuff last? He asked. Depends on the dose and the compound. The compulsion traces look low-grade, the kind that build up over time rather than hit hard and fast. That's actually more insidious, because you'd never notice a sudden change in your behavior. You'd just gradually find yourself more agreeable than usual, more likely to go along with things, more, she paused. More malleable. Malleable, Harry repeated. There was something very flat in how he said it. Yes. She held his gaze. Someone wanted you easy to manage. Another silence. Ron looked between them and appeared to be doing the maths on whether this was the sort of conversation he should be in, and then apparently decided that he was committed now. Who? He asked. Who'd do that? He's 11. He's just starting school. That's rather the point, Hermione said. He's Harry Potter starting school. Whoever did this wanted to manage him, from the very beginning. She looked at the bag again. The affection enhancer is the more troubling one, actually. Compulsion on its own is about general control. The enhancer is more targeted. Someone wanted him to feel warmth toward a particular person or group when they introduced themselves. It requires a primer, a separate compound that gets activated when he meets whoever the target is. She stood up, brushing her knees off. Which means there's probably a second delivery mechanism. Something he's already had, or something he'll be given today. Harry looked at his chocolate frog. At the pumpkin juice on the seat beside him. At the various things he'd eaten and drunk since getting on the train. Right, he said. Then he pushed all of it away and looked at Hermione. Show me what you found. She showed him. She went through it methodically, the shimmer on the wrappers, the way the detection solution changed color, what each color meant, the distinction between the compulsion and the affection enhancer, the mechanics of how a primer would work. He listened to everything without interrupting, which she appreciated. He asked two sharp questions, one about duration, one about whether the potion would have been noticeable to anyone administering a standard Hogwarts medical intake check, and both questions were good ones, the kind that told you someone was actually thinking and not just reacting. To the second one, she said, no. The doses are too low and too carefully layered. Whoever made this knew what they were doing. This isn't someone who bought something off a dodgy market stall. This is custom work. Custom work is expensive, Ron said. He'd pulled his knees up to his chest and was watching them with wide eyes. Yes, Hermione said. Which means rich, Harry said. Or connected, Hermione said. Though in this world, I suspect those tend to be the same thing. Harry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I haven't been eating those the whole time. Just since we left the station. He was counting back. I had maybe 4 or 5. Before you found them. I know. She was already thinking about this. The low-grade compulsion won't do anything lasting from that few doses, it needs to accumulate, takes weeks or months usually. The affection enhancer won't activate without the primer, and as far as I can tell you haven't encountered anyone yet who seems to be the intended target, so it hasn't activated. She looked at him steadily. You're fine, Harry. I mean that. None of this has actually worked yet. Something shifted in his face, not relief exactly, but close to it. A very small unwinding of something he'd been holding very tightly. Yet, he said. I'll make sure it doesn't, she said. It came out more simply and more certainly than she'd planned, and she felt slightly surprised by her own conviction, but not enough to walk it back. Ron picked up his chocolate frog again, regarded it for a long moment, and then ate it. So what do we do? He said through a mouthful of chocolate. Tell someone. We have to be careful who we tell, Hermione said immediately. Whoever did this clearly has resources and connections. If we tell the wrong adult, if we tell someone who is part of whatever this is, or who owes something to whoever's behind it, the evidence disappears, we get told it was a misunderstanding, and whoever did it knows we're onto them. That's a lot of if and whoever, Ron said. Yes, Hermione said. That's rather the problem. She took the green bag and sealed it carefully inside one of her spare potion vials. It didn't fit perfectly, but enough of the opening was inside the vial that she could get a sealed cap on it and at least preserve what residue was left without additional contamination. She put it in her bag, next to the detection vials. Then she sat back down, crossed her legs, and opened her book again, not to read, exactly, but because she thought better with a book open in her hands, which was a quirk she'd never tried to explain to anyone because it wasn't the sort of thing that explained well. I want to find out who put it in your trunk, she said. Not who made it, not yet. Who put it there? Because that's the person with access to where you were before today. The Dursleys, Harry said. His voice was very neutral when he said the name. Your aunt and uncle. And cousin. He paused. They wouldn't have, though. They don't care about me enough to go to the effort. And they hate magic. They wouldn't touch anything like this. Then someone visited. Or sent something. Harry thought. She watched him sift through memory with that same tidy focus and felt a small, sharp recognition, the way another organized mind looked when it worked. There was someone, he said slowly. About 2 weeks ago. Said they were collecting for something, charity, I think, or I assumed it was charity. They gave me things, which was odd because no one, he stopped. Recalibrated. I thought I was just glad to meet someone who wasn't horrible to me. Maybe I was glad because of something they gave me first. The primer, Hermione thought. Given first, so that the affection enhancer in the food would activate when Harry met whoever this person was pointing him toward. What did they give you? She asked. Juice, Harry said. Just a little bottle of it. I thought it was, he stopped again. I thought it was kind. It took Hermione a moment to say anything, because what she was feeling was not useful to the analysis but it was real, a bright, hot surge of anger that someone had looked at this boy and decided the best approach was to make him chemically grateful for ordinary human decency. Who was it? She said, very quietly. I don't know. I'd never seen them before. They said they said they'd known my parents. He said it carefully, like it was a thing with edges. I didn't think to question it. Of course he hadn't. He was an 11-year-old boy raised in a household that apparently withheld basic warmth as a matter of policy, and someone had offered him connection to parents he'd never known, and he'd drunk what he was given because why wouldn't he? Why would it occur to him to check? Right, Hermione said, and her voice came out flat and controlled and entirely at odds with what was happening in her chest. We keep the bag. We note down everything you remember about the visitor, what they looked like, what they said, when exactly they came. When we get to school, I'm going to find the detection texts in the library and I'm going to find out exactly what compound this is and who would have access to making it. She looked at him. And we don't tell anyone yet. Not until we know who we can trust. Harry looked at her for a long moment. Why are you doing this? He asked. Not suspiciously. Just, genuinely curious, with a directness that she found disarming. Because someone drugged a child, she said. And it made me angry. She paused. Also, I find potion chemistry very interesting, so there's that as well. He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh, short and surprised, like it had gotten out before he'd decided to allow it, and it transformed his face entirely. She found herself smiling back before she'd made any decision to do so. Hermione Granger, he said, like he was confirming something. Harry Potter, she said. Outside the window, the countryside had turned green and wild, the tidy fields around London giving way to hills and forests and the particular untamed quality of landscape that hadn't been managed in a long time. Hogwarts was getting closer. The train rocked gently on the rails. Ron, who had been quiet for an unusual stretch, said, I want to help. Whatever you're doing, I want to help. He sounded very earnest and slightly worried that they'd say no. The Weasleys don't have a lot, yeah, but we've got a lot of people, and my dad works at the ministry, and, well. He's always saying you've got to do the right thing even when it's inconvenient. He'd probably be sick about this. Hermione looked at him and saw that he meant it entirely, and that the offer came from the same reflex that had made him share his sweets with strangers 20 minutes after meeting them. She catalogued him again and updated, loud, kind, self-conscious about money, desperate to impress, and fundamentally decent without trying to be. Thank you, she said. We might need that. But right now we need to be careful, so please don't tell anyone, even your family, until we know more. Yeah, all right. He nodded vigorously. My lips are sealed. Then, after a beat, except I might tell Fred and George eventually because they'd actually be brilliant at this kind of thing. Hermione opened her mouth to object and Harry said, Who are Fred and George? And Ron launched into a description of his twin brothers that lasted until the mountains came into view, carrying on the same energy of someone who loves the people he's talking about with a complete and unself-conscious wholeness. Hermione listened with half her attention and thought with the other half, and what she was thinking about was who in the wizarding world would have the resources and motivation to begin dosing Harry Potter before he'd taken a single class at Hogwarts. The answer, when she laid it out logically, was not short. It was not reassuring. And it pointed, with uncomfortable specificity, toward a category of people who had power, tradition, and a vested interest in controlling the most famous child in the magical world before he was old enough to know he needed protecting. Old families. Wealthy ones. The kind who thought in generations and made plans in decades. She thought about the amber in the vials. She thought about that deep, burnished gold. She thought, someone decided this was acceptable. Someone did this to an 11-year-old boy and thought it was simply good planning. And underneath the analysis and the cataloging and the careful, methodical anger, something settled in Hermione Granger that she would not have been able to name yet, at 11, with the mountains outside the window and Hogwarts still invisible over the next rise. It was the feeling of a decision being made. Not a decision about what to do today, or this week. A larger one. The kind that feels less like a choice and more like a recognition, like you've just identified the shape of something you were already going to do, and now you simply know it. Someone had to push back. Someone had to say this is not acceptable and here is why and here is what happens next. And the people with the most to lose were not going to do it, and the people with institutional power had apparently decided it wasn't their problem, and so it was going to have to be someone else. Hermione was, she would be the first to admit, not humble about her own abilities. She knew what she was good at. She knew what she was willing to do. And sitting on a train that smelled like chocolate and old upholstery with a sealed evidence vial in her bag, watching the mountains get closer, she felt something settle into place. The castle appeared on the horizon as the last light of the evening went gold against the hills, towers and battlements and lights in windows, enormous and ancient and absolutely real, and she felt the now familiar jolt of recognition that had hit her the first time she read about it, the sense of yes, this is where I was supposed to be. It hadn't diminished, seeing it in person. It was bigger. Harry said, very quietly, there it is. He was looking at it the way she felt about it, not with the casual familiarity of the students who'd grown up knowing it was coming, but with something more raw than that. Something that looked a lot like finally. Yes, she said. They crossed the lake in small boats, and the water was black and still and reflected the castle doubled, lights above and lights below. Hermione shared a boat with Harry and a girl called Lavender who talked about whether they'd see the giant squid, and Hermione thought about detection solutions and old money and the particular cruelty of people who thought that controlling someone was the same as caring for them. She thought, I'm going to find out who did this. And then I'm going to make them answer for it. In the boat, Harry glanced at her sideways and she got the feeling, with the odd, instinctive perception she had for people she liked, that he was thinking something similar. The castle doors opened. Warmth and candlelight and hundreds of faces and a ceiling full of stars. Professor McGonagall was waiting for them, sharp and exacting and somehow immediately more real to Hermione than any teacher she'd ever had, and the Sorting Hat was a hat that sang and spoke and saw things, which was extraordinary, and Hermione sat on the stool and felt it press onto her head and she thought very clearly, Gryffindor, if you please, I have work to do. The hat said, almost instantly, Gryffindor. Harry followed. Ron followed. Neville, who had apparently been going in alphabetical order, was called up several names before Harry, and Hermione watched him walk to the stool with his shoulders held in a very specific way, not the natural shyness of someone quiet by temperament, but the careful, controlled physical self-containment of someone who had learned that the best way not to get something wrong was to take up as little space as possible. She filed that away. The Sorting Hat had barely touched his head before it shouted Gryffindor, which made Neville look startled in a way that told Hermione the Hat's confidence in him was more than he'd expected from himself. Dinner appeared on the tables and it was extraordinary, the sheer variety and abundance of it, and Hermione ate and answered questions from Percy Weasley about her academic background and exchanged one brief, meaningful look with Harry across the table, and felt, underneath all of it, that low steady hum of focused purpose. After the feast, walking back through the castle behind Percy's narration of house rules, she fell into step beside Harry. Tomorrow, she said, quietly enough that only he could hear. Tomorrow, he agreed. Library first. Then we figure out who has access to the potion's chemistry at the level we're dealing with. He nodded. And Harry, she glanced at him. Eat only from the common bowls at meals. Nothing given to you directly by anyone you don't know yet. Yeah, he said. And then, thanks. For not making it weird. Some people would have made it very weird. She considered this. It is weird, she said honestly. But being weird about it won't help. He smiled, that short, surprised smile again, and they followed the prefect up the moving stairs and into Gryffindor Tower, and Hermione lay in her new bed that night with the curtains half open so she could see the stars through the tower window, and thought about amber in a vial, and old families with deep pockets, and a boy who had learned to be grateful for crumbs of ordinary kindness. She thought about what it would take to dismantle something that had been built over generations. She thought about the specific combination of skills she had, the reading, the memory, the absolute and total unwillingness to back down when she knew she was right. She thought, someone is going to be very sorry they used that green bag. She fell asleep thinking that, which was, for Hermione Granger, approximately the most comfortable feeling in the world. Chapter 2, The Architecture of Quiet Harm. The library opened at 7 in the morning. Hermione knew this because she had asked Prefect Percy on the walk up to the tower, and Percy had told her with the specific pleasure of someone who likes being asked for information, and she had made a note of it in the small leather notebook she'd started keeping for exactly this purpose. The notebook had 3 sections: what we know, what we need to find, and who we can trust. The third section was, at present, mostly empty. She was outside the library doors at 6:58. Harry was already there, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his arms wrapped around his knees, looking like someone who had also not slept particularly well. He glanced up when she arrived and said nothing, which she appreciated. There was a quality to his silence that was different from Ron's or Neville's. It didn't ask anything of you. "You're early," she said. "You're earlier," he said. "I left at 6:53. It took me 5 minutes to find this corridor." "I left at 6:50, he said, which was honest in a way that made her smile, and she sat down cross-legged on the floor beside him and opened her notebook to the what we need to find section. "I made a list," she said, which surprised no one. He leaned over to read it. The list had 11 items, which she had organized by research priority, the most immediately actionable at the top, the background contextual items further down. He read the whole thing without rushing, which was increasingly something she noticed about him, the way he gave things his full attention without performing the act of paying attention. "Item 4, he said. Cross-reference compulsion potion variants with known suppliers active in the last decade. How do we do that from a school library? We probably can't, completely. But there are potions reference texts that list variants by complexity and required ingredients, and some of those texts will have footnotes citing suppliers or case studies citing named manufacturers in legal records. It won't give us everything, but it'll give us a framework." She paused. "And I've also written to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement." He looked at her. "Last night," she said. "Before bed. I used the owl post. There was a notice in the common room about how to use it. I didn't give them specifics. I just asked, as a student doing research, about the current legal status of compulsion potions and affection enhancers used on minors, and whether there were any ongoing investigations into such use, and how such cases had been prosecuted historically." She met his look. "It'll come back as a form letter, probably. But how they respond will tell us something about how seriously they take it." He seemed to be looking for the right word. "That's clever. It's standard investigative methodology," she said, which was a phrase she had gotten from a Muggle detective novel she'd read at 9 and filed under useful frameworks, and she said it with complete sincerity. The library doors opened at exactly 7, and Madame Pants appeared in the doorway already holding a book, which told Hermione immediately that this was a woman after her own heart, and she stepped forward with what she hoped was a respectful but confident expression. "First years are not typically here this early," Madame Pants said, looking at them over the cover of her book. "We have specific research needs," Hermione said. Madame Pants looked at them for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. "Touch nothing with food-contaminated hands. Do not shelve what you pull. Do not speak above a murmur." "Absolutely," Hermione said, and they went in. The Hogwarts library smelled like old paper and something else underneath, something faintly alchemical, as though even the books absorbed the general magical atmosphere of the building over centuries, and the smell had worked its way into the shelving and the stone. Hermione breathed it in and felt immediately better than she had since the train. She went to potions and chemistry first, which occupied a long stretch of shelving near the back. Harry followed, and she handed him a short list of titles she'd memorized from the bibliography in Practical Potions and their detection the night before, and said, "Those ones. Pull them and stack them on that table," and he did it without needing to be told twice. She found compulsion compounds, historical and contemporary use on the third shelf from the top, which required the small stepladder Madame Pants had pointedly left in this section, and got it down and sat with it and opened it on the table between them. They worked for an hour. Hermione read fast, always had, with a pencil moving over her notebook, noting page references and specific compound names. Harry read slower but retained more precisely. She discovered this when she said, "The Halcyon-Brennan compound, page 93, what was the listed duration?" And he said, "Up to 14 weeks with repeated low-dose exposure, longer if combined with a sympathetic enhancer," without looking up from a different book, having apparently absorbed the relevant passage peripherally while reading something else entirely. She stopped for a moment and looked at him. He glanced up. "What?" "Nothing," she said. "You have a very good memory." He shrugged, the slight self-deprecating thing. "I had a lot of time to myself." "You read things carefully when you've got nothing else to do." She thought about what that meant, a childhood with enough isolation and enough hours in it to teach yourself to read carefully as a way of making the time bearable, and then put it away because it wasn't useful right now. Later. She'd think about it later. What they found, over the hour, was this: the compulsion residue on Harry's wrappers matched, closely enough to be significant, a compound profile called Mill influence, a low-grade, slow-building compliance potion that had been documented in 17 cases in the last 30 years, always used on children between the ages of 8 and 14, always in the context of what the legal records called arranged association, which was the ministry's extremely polite way of describing families who wanted to ensure that their children formed bonds with specific targets by chemically ensuring the target liked them. The affection enhancer in the wrappers was a standard primer-activated compound, nothing unusual about its chemistry, but the combination of the two was the tell. Used together, they created a very specific effect, a subject who was generally compliant and also specifically warm toward whoever triggered the primer. Easy to manage, easy to endear. It was, in the dry language of the potion's text, a common tactic employed in the formation of politically advantageous associations. Common. Harry read that word off the page and said it aloud with a very quiet blankness and then set the book down with extreme care, which Hermione had already come to recognize as the way he handled things that deserved much more expressive reactions. 17 documented cases, she said. Meaning 17 cases where someone noticed, or someone reported it, or someone died with evidence on them. The actual number is higher. How much higher? Impossible to say. But based on the note at the bottom of page 41, there's a footnote about an internal ministry review in 1978 that was suppressed. The actual estimate at the time was somewhere between 40 and 60 active cases in a single decade. She turned the book toward him so he could see the footnote. And that was 40 years ago. Harry read the footnote. He read it again. Who suppressed it, he said. The review board, which in 1978 included representatives from, she consulted her notes. 6 families. The Malfoys, the Blacks, the Knotts, the Averys, the Rosiers, and the Parkinsons. She paused. Of those 6, 4 are still actively politically engaged in the ministry as of current reference. The silence was the particular kind that forms around significant things. Okay, Harry said, finally. They covered it up. They almost certainly participated in it, Hermione said. Covering it up was just the tidying afterward. She wrote all of it in the notebook. She wrote precisely and quickly, citing page numbers and footnotes, because evidence was only useful if it was properly documented. She had learned that from the detective novel too. They left the library at 8:30 and went down to breakfast separately. Hermione had suggested this, because there was no reason to be obvious about the fact that they were working together on something, at least not yet. And Hermione sat between Parvati Patil and Lavender Brown and ate toast and answered Lavender's questions about whether she thought the boys at the Slytherin table were looking over and thought about 17 documented cases and what 40 to 60 would mean if you worked that number out across 3 decades into the present day. It was a large number. Across the table, Harry was eating carefully from the common plates, she noticed. Not in an obvious way. Just, choosing things from the center of the table, passing over anything that had been set at his specific place. He caught her eye once and she gave the smallest nod and he nodded back and that was that. The morning was lessons, Transfiguration with Professor McGonagall, who made the entire class turn matchsticks into needles and watched them all with an expression of comprehensive assessment, the way you might watch a group of investment proposals knowing you'd eventually fund only the worthwhile ones. Hermione's needle was perfect. She knew it was perfect. She also knew it wasn't the most important thing she had to do today, which was a strange feeling. Charms was after that, and then a free period before lunch, and she used the free period to find Neville. He was in the corridor outside the greenhouses, not in them, which would have been the obvious place, but sitting on a bench outside them in the thin September sun, reading something that turned out to be a herbology primer he'd apparently brought from home. He looked up when she sat down next to him with a slightly startled expression, the reflexive flinch of someone who has learned that being noticed often precedes something unpleasant. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said, carefully. "I'm not here to ask you anything difficult," she said, because he was clearly bracing for it and there was no point letting him do that. "Well, I might be here to ask you something difficult. But it's important." His hands went still on the book. He didn't look at her yet. She had noticed the flinch on the train, and she had thought about it afterward with the same methodical attention she gave to everything, and she had not wanted to jump to conclusions. But the flinch was very specific, it wasn't the generic startle of an anxious person. It was the physical echo of conditioning. The way a muscle memory gets built not from one bad thing but from consistent repeated small things, the body learning contact precedes discomfort at a level below conscious thought. She had read about it in a Muggle psychology text she'd found at the back of her school library in Year 5, not because she was looking for it but because she read everything she found, and the description had stuck. "Neville," she said, carefully. "When did you start feeling nervous around people?" He blinked at her. His grip on the herbology book tightened slightly. I'm just shy." "I know." "But," she hesitated, organizing the question. "Is it shyness like you want to be alone? Or shyness like you want to be with people but something keeps stopping you?" He opened his mouth. Closed it. Looked at his book, which was a method of buying thinking time she recognized from her own repertoire. "The second one," he said, very quietly. "Right." She turned toward him slightly. "Can I ask you something and I want you to be honest, because the answer matters and I'm not going to think anything bad of you either way?" He nodded, still looking at the book. "Has anyone ever given you food or drink that you didn't ask for, or that seemed to come from nowhere, particularly around family visits or social situations? Sweets, or a drink, or something that just appeared?" The silence was longer this time. Much longer. She waited. Neville's grip on the book went very tight and then very deliberately loosened, the way you control something when you don't want it to show. "At the Parkinsons," he said at last. "Every summer, since I was 8. There's always juice or cordial before the main gathering, and Gran always makes me drink it because it's polite, and after I always feel very," he stopped. "I feel very agreeable. Like nothing's wrong. Like I want to smile at everyone and not take up much space." He finally looked at her. "I thought I was just nervous. I thought the nervousness made me feel strange." Hermione felt the anger again, clean and bright and very precisely aimed. 8 years old. 3 years of summer cordial at the Parkinsons, a cordial that made him agreeable and small and undemanding, and Neville Longbottom had sat in those gatherings and called it his own personality. "It wasn't nervousness," she said. She watched him understand that. She watched it move across his face in stages, first the frown of not quite getting it, then the slow widening of eyes as the implication landed, then something harder to watch, the specific expression of someone revising their understanding of their own history and finding the new version worse and also somehow more accurate than the old one. "They were dosing me," he said. "I believe so, yes. For 3 years. That's what it sounds like." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why?" And this was the answer she was less certain of, but she'd been thinking about it since breakfast and she had a framework at least. The Longbottoms are an old family. Your parents were well regarded, influential, before she paused carefully, because the details of what had happened to his parents were in the books she'd read and she didn't know how much he wanted said aloud. Before what happened to them. You're the heir. And your grandmother has a seat on various boards and trusts that a certain kind of family would find useful to have access to. She looked at him. The Parkinsons have a daughter your age. Neville stared at her. Pansy, he said. She's in Slytherin. She's always been very, when we meet at things, she's always very, he stopped. She always seemed to like me. And I always liked her, even though I couldn't really explain why because she's not very, he stopped again. Oh. I think you might be a target for an arranged association, Hermione said. The same mechanism used on Harry. Different family, different target, same method. She paused. You're not the only one they did this to. Neville sat very still for a long moment. Then he said, with a quietness that was nothing like his usual self-conscious quiet, with something harder and more fundamental at the center of it, what are we doing about it? She pulled out her notebook. The free period ended and lunch came and went, and during potions in the afternoon, Snape, who managed to be unpleasant with the precision of someone who practiced it and made a point of establishing that fame was not the same as ability while looking specifically at Harry, who bore it with a stillness that Hermione respected, she was thinking about the 1978 suppressed review. About 17 documented cases. About the footnote. Harry, sitting beside her, was apparently also not entirely focused on the cure for boils they were meant to be preparing, because he nudged her elbow and when she looked over he'd written something on the edge of his parchment in very small letters, Snape. Is he? She looked at him. Mouthed, unknown. Possible. He wrote, he knows something. Watch his face when he looks at me. She watched. The next time Snape swept past their table, she watched his face when his eyes hit Harry, and she saw what Harry meant. It wasn't just dislike, or the generalized contempt Snape dispensed evenly in all directions. There was something specific there. An intensity that was too complicated to be ordinary spite. Something with a history in it. She wrote back, later. He nodded. After potions, she caught Neville in the corridor and gave him the 3 things she'd pulled from the library during her free period after their greenhouse conversation, a pamphlet on potion detection, a short guide on residual compound clearance, because the buildup from 3 years of exposure needed addressing, and she had a list of counteracting foods and mild cleansing teas that could help, all available in the Hogwarts kitchens if you asked the right way, and a folded piece of parchment on which she had written exactly what she wanted him to do for the next 2 weeks, which was primarily, eat from common dishes only, don't accept anything individually given, note any behavior or feeling that seems disproportionate or chemical in quality. Neville took all 3 items and held them like they were important things. Then he said, "You've done all this today?" "And last night," she said. "You've been here 2 days." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize, something between gratitude and a kind of awe that she found slightly uncomfortable because she hadn't done anything yet. She'd found things. Documenting things and doing things about them were different. "I want to help," he said, and it sounded different from Ron's offer on the train, not the bright, energetic I want in of someone drawn to the adventure, but something quieter. A person who had been quiet and small for years for reasons he now understood, and wanted to not be that anymore. "Whatever I can do." "Right now," she said, "the most useful thing you can do is pay attention to everything around you. You've been in the wizarding world your whole life and I've been in it for 2 months. You know things I don't know. Names, connections, who knows who, which families socialize together. Write down anything that seems relevant." She paused. "You're very good at noticing things, I think. You've had to be." He blinked. I'm not particularly, Neville." She looked at him steadily. You've been navigating a world that was being chemically manipulated around you since you were 8 and you still managed to have preferences, form opinions, resist things instinctively. That takes something. Use it. He looked at her for a long moment and then straightened slightly, almost imperceptibly. Not dramatically. Just, a small recalibration of how much space he was allowing himself. All right, he said. Harry was waiting for her at the portrait hole when she arrived at the common room after dinner. He'd clearly been watching for her, positioned where he could see the corridor without it being obvious he was watching. She noticed and said nothing, and they went to a corner of the common room that was relatively private, 2 armchairs angled away from the main seating area. I found something else, he said. She sat forward. I was talking to Ron at dinner. He kept his voice low and level. He was telling me about his family, just, you know how he does, just talks about them as information rather than, anyway. He mentioned something. About last year. About a boy called not at his prep tutoring sessions. Pure-blood families do preparation tutoring before Hogwarts sometimes, apparently, it's social as much as educational. He said Theodore Nott had been there, and also Draco Malfoy, and he said Malfoy had been, Harry paused, working something through. He said Malfoy had been given things by his parents before social events, and after he had them he was different. More like what they wanted him to be. Hermione went still. Draco Malfoy, she said. 10 years old, Harry said. At a tutoring session. She opened her notebook. Wrote it down. Thought about it. This was different, and the difference mattered. Harry and Neville were targets, people being managed so that other people could form advantageous connections to them. But if what Ron was describing was accurate, then Draco Malfoy was something else entirely, a child being dosed by his own family to make him a better social instrument. Not managed from outside. Shaped from within. There might be a distinction we need to keep track of, she said. Between families using potions on other people's children and families using potions on their own children. They're both wrong. But the second one, using it on your own child to make them a better asset, that's something specific. It says something about what these families actually think children are for. Harry was quiet. They're tools, he said. Yes. To them, I mean. They looked at me, at a baby, basically, and saw a tool they wanted to calibrate. Yes. She held his gaze. And I think that's what we need to keep at the center of this. Not just the law. The law is the mechanism. But the thing underneath it, the thing we're actually arguing against, is that belief. That children are assets to be managed. He nodded slowly. In the firelit corner of the Gryffindor common room, with Ron across the room teaching Neville a card game and the noise of 30 other first and second years around them, Harry Potter looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as the one he used when he decided something. So we're not just finding out who did it to me, he said. No, she said. We're building a case. We're building a case. He leaned back. How long will that take? As long as it takes, she said. But we have the library. We have the evidence from the train. We have Neville. We have Ron's testimony about Malfoy, though that's second-hand and we'd need to be careful with it. And I have a letter out to the ministry. She paused. Also, I've been thinking about the suppressed 1978 review. If the ministry has a copy buried somewhere, or if there's any public record of the families cited in it, the prophet, Harry said. Or another paper. There might be archives. Yes. She wrote it down. We need access to Wizarding newspaper archives. The Hogwarts library might have back issues, or Madame Pants might know where to find them. I'll ask her tomorrow, Harry said. She seemed to like you. Might be worth having you ask. She liked that I was quiet and respectful about the books. Right. You ask, then. She almost smiled. Deal. He stretched his arms above his head, the restless movement of someone who had been thinking in one direction for a long time and needed to decompress, and then said, more quietly, "Do you think Dumbledore knows?" She'd been waiting for this question because she'd been asking herself the same one all day. "I think," she said carefully, "that Dumbledore is extremely intelligent, and has been running this institution for a very long time, and is embedded in the political world of Wizarding Britain in ways we don't fully understand yet." She paused. "I think it would be difficult for a person like that to genuinely not know about a practice that 17 cases were documented and covered up for." "So you think yes?" "I think knows something is different from is complicit. And I don't know which one yet." She looked at him. "But I think we shouldn't tell him what we're doing until we know." Harry absorbed this. Something complicated moved across his face, not surprise, exactly. More like a person confirming a suspicion they hadn't wanted to confirm. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." Across the room, Neville had apparently lost the card game and was laughing about it, not his usual careful, self-contained reaction but a real laugh, a bit undignified, eyes crinkling. Ron was delighted. Hermione watched it and thought about what 3 years of summer cordial had been taking from him, the ease of it, the ordinary unself-conscious enjoyment of being with people without checking first whether you were allowed to take up space. She turned back to her notebook and made 3 new entries in the What We Need to Find section. First, access to 1978 Ministry Review, full text. Names of all cited families. Second, method of identifying current active cases, other children currently being dosed. There will be more than Neville. There will be more than Harry. Third, and she pressed a little harder with the pencil as she wrote it, a way to make this public. Not to the Ministry. Somewhere the Ministry can't bury it. Because that was the thing she'd been circling all day, the shape of the problem becoming clearer the more she looked at it. The Ministry had already buried it once. The families involved had reached into the Ministry, had seats on review boards, had political alliances, had the quiet unspoken understanding of people who had always been the ones who decided what was documented and what wasn't. If they went to the Ministry, the evidence would disappear and they'd end up being the problem. An 11-year-old girl making allegations against wealthy pureblood families was the easiest kind of problem to make disappear. So they needed something else. A way to make the information exist publicly before anyone had the chance to contain it. A record that couldn't be recalled, a set of facts that were already out in the world before anyone knew they were coming. She needed a journalist. She didn't know any journalists yet. She knew how libraries worked and she knew how to read footnotes and she knew how compulsion potions metabolized through the liver, but she didn't know a single person who wrote for a newspaper. Yet, she thought. She closed the notebook and looked up at the common room, at the fire and the noise and the red and gold and all these people who were, almost entirely, exactly what they appeared to be, which was a luxury she was beginning to understand was rarer than it should be. "Get some sleep," she told Harry. "You too," he said. "I'm going to read for an hour first." He gave her a look. "About something unrelated," she said. "I need to not think about this for 60 minutes or I'll dream about compound profiles." He laughed the surprised laugh again. "What are you going to read about?" "Magical creatures," she said. "Specifically botruckles, because I found a monograph in the library and the care of magical plants and creatures section starts next week and I'd like to be prepared." Harry looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read, warm, and slightly wondering, and oddly like he was filing something away. "Okay," he said. "Good night, Hermione." "Good night, Harry." She went upstairs with her book. She read about botruckles for exactly 53 minutes before she fell asleep with the book open on her chest, and she dreamed about nothing in particular. In the morning, there was a letter on the breakfast table. Official seal. Ministry of Magic, Department of Magical Law Enforcement. She had not expected a reply this fast. She opened it carefully, smoothing the parchment on the table, and read. It was not a form letter. It was 4 sentences, written in a hand that was controlled and official and entirely too precisely noncommittal for a genuine reply, the kind of language that had been carefully designed to say nothing while appearing to say something. We acknowledge your inquiry. Matters of this nature fall under the purview of several departments. We encourage students to direct educational questions to their school authorities. Thank you for your interest. She read it twice. Folded it. Put it in her notebook. Then she wrote a second letter, not to the ministry this time, not to any official body, but to a name she'd found in a footnote in the Potions Law, an overview text, buried under a citation about the 1978 case. See also Weatherwick, D., Independent Reporting, The Quill, Volume 12, Issues 34 to 38, for civilian documentation of cases not recorded in official channels. She didn't know if the Quill was still running. She didn't know if D. Weatherwick was still alive. She didn't know if a small independent paper had any interest in a letter from an 11-year-old with a notebook full of library citations and a sealed evidence file in her trunk. But the ministry had replied in 4 sentences that meant stop asking. And Hermione Granger had never, in 11 years of living, responded well to being told to stop asking. She addressed the envelope. She found the school owlery after breakfast, walked up 6 flights of stairs, picked a sturdy-looking tawny owl, and sent it. Then she went to Double Charms and was the first in the class to successfully Wingardium Leviosa her feather, held it there for a full 30 seconds while Flitwick squeaked with delight, and thought about footnotes and buried reviews and what 40 to 60 cases in a decade became when you multiplied it forward by 3 more decades. Somewhere under the surface of ordinary first-year lessons and adjusting to a new castle and making friends and learning to do magic, something was building. She could feel it the way you feel a storm in the air before it comes, a specific quality to the pressure, a charge, a sense of something large and inevitable gathering itself at a distance. Good, she thought. Let it gather. Chapter 3, Luna and the List. The reply from the Quill came on a Thursday, 11 days after she'd sent the letter. Hermione was halfway through breakfast when a small, slightly battered owl dropped an envelope directly into her porridge. She fished it out, wiped it on a napkin, and opened it while Harry watched from across the table with the patience of someone who had learned not to rush her through things. The letter was short. 3 paragraphs in a cramped, energetic handwriting that moved uphill across the page like it was trying to escape the margins. Miss Granger, your letter reached me through some considerable forwarding, as the Quill has moved offices twice since Volume 12. I am D. Weatherwick. I am very much alive, though not, of late, particularly busy with anything worth writing about. What you describe is either very important or very wrong, and in my experience those 2 things are rarely mutually exclusive. I would need more than a library citation and a sealed vial described in a letter. I would need documentation. Primary sources. I would need, frankly, more than one child's account, because one child's account, forgive me, is the easiest thing in the world to dismiss. If you have more than that, or believe you can find more than that, write again. I will not ignore you. D.W. Hermione read it twice, folded it into her notebook, and felt something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it, the specific feeling of throwing a line into water and feeling the tug back. Well? Harry said. He wants more, she said. Which means he's interested. He. D. Weatherwick. I'll know more when I write back. She picked up her spoon and finished her porridge. We need primary sources. Neville's account is useful but it's his subjective experience. We need either physical evidence of more cases or documentation connecting the families to supply chains for these compounds. She paused. And more children. More accounts. More names. Harry was quiet for a moment, eating toast. There's a girl, he said. She looked up. In the library. I've seen her there twice in the early mornings. Ravenclaw, I think, based on the badge. She's got, he thought about how to describe it. She's got a lot of notebooks. Different colors. And she was reading something in the restricted section corridor, not in the restricted section, just near it, sitting on the floor outside, which seems like a strange place to read unless, unless you're waiting for something to come out of the restricted section, Hermione said. Or unless you know something's in the restricted section that you want and haven't been able to get to yet. He shrugged. She looked at me when I walked past. Most people look at me and then try to pretend they weren't looking. She just looked and then went back to her book. Which means she was looking because she was curious, Hermione said, not because of who you are. Yeah. He met her eyes. I thought that was worth noting. She thought about it all through Transfiguration, where they had progressed from matchsticks to small wooden boxes and where she succeeded on the second attempt but was mostly thinking sideways, running the problem through one part of her brain while another part managed the incantation. The restricted section corridor. Multiple colored notebooks. A Ravenclaw who had been keeping records on something for long enough to fill multiple notebooks and who sat outside the restricted section like she was waiting for access. After lunch, she went to find her. The library was quieter in the early afternoon, most students were in class or outside in the thin October sun that had arrived tentatively that week. Hermione went past the main stacks to the back of the library where the restricted section sat behind its rope and its lock, and she found the corridor that ran alongside it, a narrow stone passage that connected the back of the library to a staircase rarely used, and there she was. She was small and fair-haired, wearing her Ravenclaw robes with an additional pair of radish earrings that were not standard uniform issue, sitting cross-legged on the floor with 3 notebooks open around her and a 4th on her lap, writing with a silver quill in handwriting that was extremely neat and went in perfectly straight lines despite the absence of ruled paper. She didn't look up when Hermione came around the corner. "Hello," Hermione said. "Hello," the girl said. "I'm Hermione Granger. I'm a first year in Gryffindor." "I know." The girl turned a page. "You're the one who borrowed compulsion compounds, historical and contemporary use at 7 in the morning 2 weeks ago." She said it simply, not showing off. Just reporting a fact. Madame Pants mentioned it. Not to me specifically. She mentions unusual borrowing to the air sometimes. I think she talks to the books when it's quiet. Hermione blinked. "I think that's probably true. I'm Luna Lovegood." She looked up for the first time, and she had very large pale gray eyes that gave the impression of seeing more than they were focused on, the way some people appear to be looking at the whole picture rather than any specific part of it. "You wanted to ask me something." It wasn't a question. "Harry Potter noticed you in this corridor," Hermione said, deciding that directness was the only appropriate register for this particular person. "More than once. He said you had several notebooks." Luna considered this. Harry Potter has very observant eyes for someone who's supposed to be distracted by being famous. She tilted her head. "What specifically did you want to ask me? What are you keeping records of?" The pause was short and thoughtful, not evasive. Luna looked at her notebooks for a moment and then said, "Chemical interference." Everything in Hermione went very still. "Can you say more about that?" she said. Luna uncrossed her legs, stood up in one smooth motion, and gathered her notebooks with the practiced efficiency of someone who moved them often. "Come and sit properly," she said, and walked to the end of the corridor where there was a wide windowsill overlooking the grounds, and she sat on it cross-legged again and arranged the notebooks in front of her with a precision that looked casual but wasn't. Hermione sat beside her. Outside, the grounds were gold and green in the October light and 2 older students were throwing something back and forth on the lawn that occasionally glowed. "I started noticing it in my 2nd year," Luna said. She opened the first notebook, pale blue, labeled Observations, General in silver ink, to a page near the middle. "My father runs a newspaper. The Quibbler. He's been writing about Raxpert influence and various invisible chemical phenomena for years, and people think he's odd for it, but I grew up in a house where you're supposed to notice what other people don't notice." She smoothed the page. "I noticed that some children at social gatherings behaved differently in specific company than they did otherwise. And then I noticed that the differences always correlated with particular families. And then I started noting when the differences seemed to correlate with what they'd eaten or drunk before the relevant interaction. When you say differences, Compliance, Luna said. Warmth on demand. The specific quality of someone who is genuinely present but slightly muffled. Like they're seeing things through gauze. She turned a page. My father was dosed at the Knott family's summer gathering in 1983. He didn't realize it until several years later, when he started making connections between his behavior in that period and the compounds he'd been reading about. She said it without drama or pain, the measured delivery of someone who had processed something thoroughly enough that it had become information rather than wound. That's when I started keeping detailed records. Hermione looked at the notebook. The page it was open to had 8 names on it, dated, with notes beside each one about context, observed behavior, and what Luna had been able to infer about the probable compound involved. The notes were precise. The inferences were intelligent, citing compound profiles that matched what Hermione had been reading for the past 2 weeks. How many names total? Hermione asked. Luna turned to the back of the pale blue notebook. Then she opened the second one, dark green, labeled names and families, and turned to its last used page. Then she opened the third, yellow, compounds and sources, and the fourth, red, ministry connections. 43 confirmed, she said. That means I have direct observations, or testimony from someone I consider reliable, or physical evidence, wrapper samples or residue tests using my father's detection kits. Another 12 probably, meaning strong circumstantial evidence but nothing I'd stake a formal claim on. She looked at Hermione. You have Harry Potter and Neville Longbottom. Yes. That's 45 confirmed, plus 12 probable. She said it with the same flat evenness she'd said everything else. And those are only the ones I know about. Hermione sat with the weight of that number for a moment. 45. Children, all of them, or people who had been children when it started. 45 entries in a set of meticulously kept notebooks by a girl sitting on a windowsill in a corridor no one used, who had been watching and recording and waiting because she was the daughter of someone who believed in noticing things. I have a journalist, Hermione said. His name is Weatherwick. He writes for something called The Quill. Luna turned her head slightly. My father has corresponded with Weatherwick. He considers him one of the 3 honest journalists currently working in Britain. She paused. He'd know how to use primary documentation correctly. He said he needs more than one account. He needs physical evidence and documentation. Hermione looked at the notebooks. This is exactly what he needs. I know, Luna said, quite simply. Have you been waiting for someone to do something with them? Luna appeared to consider whether this was the right framing. I've been waiting for the right moment, she said. I couldn't do it alone. Not because I was afraid, but because my father's paper isn't large enough and I'm too young to have the institutional credibility to make the documentation stick on its own. Someone would say a first-year Ravenclaw had fabricated it. But 2 first years and a second year with 4 notebooks, a sealed evidence file, and a connection to an established journalist, she tilted her head again. That's harder to dismiss. He also wants to know about the ministry connection, Hermione said. The suppressed review from 1978. Luna opened the red notebook. I have 19 pages on the 1978 review, she said. Including the names of 3 people currently serving in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement who were children of review board members and who have been involved in suppressing at least 2 subsequent attempts to reopen the case. She handed Hermione the notebook. Page 4. Hermione took it and read page 4. Then pages 5 through 9. Her jaw was very tight by the time she looked up. They've known, she said. For decades, Luna agreed, without particular bitterness. The ministry knows. The families know. The school boards know, broadly. Everyone who is in a position to do something about it has some connection to the families doing it, or benefits from the political relationships those families maintain through these arrangements. She looked out the window at the gold October grounds. The only people who don't know are the ones it's being done to. And people like us. But you've had all this for, how long? The notebook started 2 years ago. The information in them goes back further, my father's memories, things he documented in his own files, things I've been able to access and cross-reference. She looked back at Hermione. I couldn't do anything with it alone. I told you that. You didn't tell anyone. Any adult? I told my father. He published a version of it in the Quibbler. Luna's expression did something very small and very controlled. No one reads the Quibbler who doesn't already believe in Nargles. People dismiss him. The information was there and people dismissed it because of who was saying it. She paused. That's why I need you. Not because you're cleverer than me, you're not, particularly, though you're very clever, but because you're Harry Potter's friend. And Harry Potter's name on a formal complaint can't be dismissed as easily as a Quibbler article. Hermione felt the truth of this land with the particular discomfort of a correct observation. That's cynical, she said. It's accurate, Luna said. There's a difference. I find most cynicism upsetting. This is just how attention distribution works. Hermione looked at her for a long moment and then made a decision that felt both obvious and important. All right, she said. I want you to work with us. Properly. I want you to meet Harry and Neville. I want to combine your documentation with what we found and send it all to Weatherwick together. Yes, Luna said, immediately. No deliberation, no performance of consideration. Just the decision, clean and quick. Can you copy out the key pages? The confirmed names, the compound evidence, the ministry connections? I've already made 2 copies of everything, Luna said. She reached into her bag and produced a second set of notebooks, the same colors, the same labeling, the same careful handwriting, and set them on the windowsill between them. Hermione stared at them. I made the copies in September, Luna said. When I saw you in the library. Before I spoke to you. I thought, if you were reading those books that early in the morning, on the second day of school, you were either looking for exactly what I was looking for or you'd found something that pointed you in the same direction. You made copies in case I was the person you'd been waiting for. Yes. Without knowing if I was. I was fairly confident. She said it not with arrogance but with the matter-of-factness of someone reporting a calibrated prediction. Your research choices in the library were very specific. Too specific for general curiosity. And you kept Harry Potter's company but you didn't orbit him, which meant you weren't drawn to him by his name, which meant something else had brought you together. She picked up her own set of notebooks and tucked them back in her bag. What brought you together? Hermione told her about the train. The green bag. The amber in the vials. Luna listened without interrupting, without exclamation, without any of the reactions that required the teller to stop and manage the listener's feelings. When Hermione finished, she said, the affection enhancer with a primer mechanism. Very sophisticated. That's Rosier-grade compound work. Rosier? The Rosier family has historically produced the most technically proficient compulsion chemists in Britain. They've disguised it as amateur potions interest for generations. She opened the yellow notebook to a page near the back and turned it toward Hermione. See the compound profile there? The layering pattern, compulsion base with affection primer activation, that specific molecular architecture, that's a Rosier signature. They've adapted it slightly over the decades but the structural approach is consistent. She tapped the page. Whoever made Harry's potions was either a Rosier or trained by one. Hermione looked at the page. She looked at the entry date on the corresponding case. She looked at the name beside the Rosier connection. Avery, she said. The Averys and Rosiers have been connected for decades. Social, political, chemical. Luna said the last word with the same weight as the first 2. The Averys are currently attempting to position their son favorably in Harry Potter's circle. They were on the 1978 review board. They have 2 sitting representatives in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Hermione was already writing. The notebook filled fast. They found Harry and Neville in the courtyard after dinner, the four of them sitting on the stone benches in the fading evening light with Luna's copied notebooks open between them. Harry said hello to Luna with no performance of celebrity, which appeared to be the right instinct because Luna acknowledged it with a small nod that felt more genuine than most people's enthusiasm. Neville looked at the notebooks with wide eyes and said nothing for a long time. 45, Harry said, when Luna had walked him through the count. He said it the same way he'd said malleable, quiet, controlled, with something hard underneath. Minimum, Luna said. And these are children. Most were children when it started. Some are now older students or graduates. Neville was on page 6 of the red notebook, reading the Ministry Connection documentation with his lips pressed together. He turned a page. Turned another one. Then he looked up. My grandmother is on this page, he said. In a different column. He pointed. Not as a perpetrator. As, what does this mean? Luna leaned over to look. That column is informed parties who took no action. The silence was very specific. Neville read the entry again. His grandmother's name. An entry in the informed column, with a date 3 years ago, which was 1 year into the Parkinson summer cordial routine. She knew, he said. Not a question. Just the statement, absorbing itself. The documentation suggests she was told and chose not to pursue it, Luna said. Gently but accurately. The Longbottom family has long-standing political ties with the Parkinsons. Your grandmother may have calculated that disrupting those ties was a worse outcome than what was happening to me, Neville said. Nobody said anything. He closed the notebook carefully and set it on the bench and sat with his hands on his knees. Hermione watched him and thought about what to say and decided that nothing was better than wrong, so she said nothing and let him have the moment. After a while, he said, okay. Just that. Okay. But in the way someone says it when they've turned something over and looked at the underside and decided the looking at was done now and it was time to move. We need to organize the documentation, Hermione said, bringing them all back to practical ground because practical ground was what Neville needed right now. We need to present it in a way that Weatherwick can use. He's a journalist, not a legal professional, but we want this to be airtight regardless of who reads it first. She looked around at them, Harry, who was watching her with that focused attention, Neville, who had his hands on his knees and a new quality of stillness about him, Luna, who was already making a list in one of her spare notebooks. Here's what I want to do. She had been thinking about this for 2 days, since Weatherwick's letter, and the outline was clear in her head. They needed a formal written document, not just notes, but a structured account, something that organized the evidence chronologically, cited sources properly, and presented the Ministry Connection as a separate and clearly argued thread rather than a footnote. It needed to be professional enough that the only response to dismissing it was active bad faith, obvious bad faith, the kind that created its own story. I'll write the structural document, she said. The argument, the evidence organization, the legal citations. Luna, I need your compound analysis and the Rosier connection worked up into a technical appendix, if Weatherwick has a consultant chemist, or if the document ever makes it in front of a legal body, I want the technical section to be independently verifiable. Luna nodded. Harry, I need your account of the train and the visitor to your house in Privet Drive, written in your own words, factual, no interpretation, just what you observed. Fine, Harry said. Neville. She looked at him. He looked back. Your account of the Parkinson's gatherings. 3 years of observations, as specific as you can be. What you were given, when, what you noticed about your behavior afterward. She paused. I know it's hard to write. But your account is important because it demonstrates sustained use, not a single incident. That establishes intent. Neville picked up the notebook she handed him. All right, he said. Also, she said, I want to send the letter in a way that can't be intercepted or traced back before it's published. That means we don't use the school owls. Luna, your father has his own post, presumably. He uses a series of private owls, Luna said. He had to, after the ministry started monitoring the Quibbler's correspondence in 2004. She paused, realizing she had possibly revealed more about her family's ongoing conflict with the ministry than they'd been prepared for. That was before I was born. But he still uses the private birds. Can you ask him to forward a package to Weatherwick? Yes, Luna said. He'll be glad to. They worked for the rest of the week. Hermione wrote the structural document in the evenings after homework, sitting at the small desk in her dormitory after Parvati and Lavender fell asleep, working by wandlight that she kept carefully dim. Harry brought his account to her on Wednesday, 2 pages, handwritten, exactly as she'd asked, factual and observational and utterly devastating in its plainness. The absence of drama in it made it worse. He wrote about the visitor at Privet Drive the way someone writes about a procedure that happened to them, methodically and without complaint, and she read it and added it to the folder and said nothing for a moment because she was managing something. He noticed. He said, "It's fine." "It's not," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it will be." Neville's account came on Thursday and it was longer than she'd expected, 6 pages in his careful, slightly unsteady handwriting, 3 years of summer gatherings unpacked with a thoroughness that told her he'd been thinking about this for a long time before she gave him the notebook. He had included specific descriptions, what the cordial tasted like, who handed it to him, the particular heavy warmth afterward, the way he'd find himself nodding to things he wouldn't normally agree to, smiling at Pansy Parkinson in a way that felt genuine but in retrospect was always activated by the same chemical cue. He had included the name of the house elf who served the drinks, which Hermione had not expected and which was potentially significant if a house elf could provide testimony. She told him this. He looked surprised that his account had produced something useful. "Neville," she said, with some firmness, "every part of your account has been useful. The house elf detail is excellent. The specificity of the taste description could help a chemist identify the exact variant. You did well." He absorbed this with the careful, slightly disbelieving manner of someone who was not accustomed to being told they'd done well at things, and she made a note to herself to be specific and direct with him more often because clearly the general encouragement wasn't landing as strongly as the particular. Luna's technical appendix arrived on Friday morning, delivered personally rather than sent, because Luna appeared to prefer delivering things in person whenever possible. It was 12 pages, immaculate, with footnotes and cross-references and a final section on the Rosier compound signature that was so precisely argued Hermione read it twice and felt genuine professional envy despite the fact that she was 11 and Luna was 12. "This is excellent," she said. "Thank you," Luna said, and then looked past Hermione's shoulder. "Someone's been watching us." Hermione turned casually. At the far end of the corridor, just disappearing around a corner, was a flash of white blonde hair. Draco Malfoy. He was gone before she could say anything. She looked at the empty corner for a moment and thought about Ron's account on the train. Malfoy, 10 years old, given things by his parents before social events, different afterward. She thought about what it meant to be the child of a family like the Malfoys, raised inside a system that used these methods as casually as social currency, having those same methods used on you by the people who claim to love you most. She thought about what you did with that knowledge at 11 years old. Whether you buried it or carried it or found someone to hand it to. "How long has he been watching?" she asked. "Long enough to see the notebooks," Luna said. "Do you think he knows what they are?" "I think," Luna said carefully, "that Draco Malfoy has been paying very close attention to anything related to compulsion chemistry since he was old enough to understand what was being done to him." "Yes. I think he knows exactly what the notebooks are." Harry, who had arrived behind Hermione while she was looking at the corner, said, "So what do we do about him?" "Nothing yet," Hermione said. "We don't approach him. We don't make him a problem or an ally until we understand which one he's choosing to be." She turned back to the group. "Right now the document is the priority. Luna, when can your father's owl be ready?" "Tomorrow morning," Luna said. "I wrote to him last night." "Good. Hermione looked at the folder in her hands: Harry's account, Neville's account, her structural document, Luna's appendix, and at the back, still sealed in its vial, the transcript of her detection test on the train wrappers with the color changes noted and the compound names written underneath in her clearest handwriting. One more thing I want to add. She pulled out the letter from the ministry. The 4-sentence non-response. She tucked it at the front of the folder. The others looked at it. Why that? Neville said. Because the story isn't just what the families did, Hermione said. It's what happens when you try to report it. The ministry's response to a straightforward information request from a student is to send 4 sentences telling her to talk to her school. That's not administrative oversight. That's a system protecting itself. She looked around at them. Weatherwick needs to see what we're dealing with. He needs to understand that the evidence and the suppression are part of the same story. She sealed the folder. She handed it to Luna, who tucked it under her arm with the same careful, unhurried manner she did everything. My father will have it to Weatherwick by Sunday, Luna said. Good, Hermione said. And then, because the moment called for something and she wasn't sure what, she said, thank you. All of you. What you've each brought to this is important. Neville looked at the floor and nodded. Harry said, we haven't done anything yet. We've done the necessary thing before the thing, she said. Which is build something that can't easily be knocked down. Luna was already walking away down the corridor, folder under her arm, radish earring swinging. She paused at the corner and looked back. Oh, she said. There's one more thing I should tell you. She said it with the quality she had for significant information, the way she placed things at the end of sentences so they could land fully. 3 of the 43 confirmed names on my list are members of the current Hogwarts Board of Governors. And one of them voted in September on the allocation of the restricted section access policy. She tilted her head. The policy that currently prevents first and second years from accessing the archive section, where the complete records of all potions-related school incidents since 1850 are kept. She let that sit. They blocked our access to the evidence, Harry said. Luna said. Then she went around the corner and was gone. Harry stood looking at the empty corridor. Then he turned to Hermione. We need to get into the restricted section, he said. Yes, Hermione said, who had been thinking exactly that for the last 30 seconds and had already started working through how. There were 3 ways to get into the restricted section legitimately: a teacher's written note, a prefect's supervised visit, or a medical pass from Madame Pomfrey for research related to documented health needs. There was a 4th way that wasn't legitimate, which she was not going to think about until she'd exhausted the other 3. She thought about Professor McGonagall, sharp, exacting, fundamentally decent in a way that Hermione had been watching for 3 weeks now. She thought about the 1978 review. She thought about 45 confirmed names. She thought about what it meant to be the kind of teacher who looked at students like people rather than assets, and whether that kind of teacher might, if presented with the right information in the right way, be willing to give a first year a note. I'm going to see Professor McGonagall, she said. Now. Neville said. Tomorrow morning, she said. Early. She picked up her bag. And this time, I'm going to tell her enough. She walked back toward the main corridor with the October castle around her, moving staircases and torchlight and centuries of old stone, and felt the thing that had been building since the train reach a new stage of itself, something larger and more structured and more dangerous than it had been 2 weeks ago. They had documentation. They had a journalist. They had 45 names and a technical appendix and a letter from the ministry that was its own kind of evidence. What they needed now was the restricted section, and a teacher who wasn't compromised, and the thing she'd been building toward since she sat on a train with a detection vial in her hand and felt a decision settle in her chest. They needed the complete record. The full history. Every name and incident and suppressed report since 1850. Because D. Weatherwick had said I need more than one child's account. She was going to give him considerably more than that. Chapter 4, The Howler Professor McGonagall's office was exactly what Hermione had expected, precise, uncluttered, with a tartan tin on the desk that was almost certainly biscuits and a fireplace that burned with the specific efficiency of someone who didn't believe in waste. The walls had framed certificates and a single painting of a Highland landscape that looked like it had been there for 40 years and would be there for 40 more. McGonagall herself listened without interrupting. That was the first thing Hermione noticed. She had prepared for interruption, had organized her argument to weather it, to absorb objections and redirect, the way you prepared for a debate. But McGonagall sat behind her desk with her hands folded and her expression controlled, and she simply listened, and that was somehow harder to navigate than objection would have been because Hermione couldn't tell what the listening was building toward. She laid it out in order. The train, the vials, the compound identification. The library research. Neville. Luna's notebooks, she had brought the copied set, and she placed them on the desk one at a time as she referenced them. The Rosier signature. The 1978 suppressed review. The Ministry's 4-sentence response. The Board of Governors' connection to the restricted section access policy. She put the sealed evidence vial last, in the center of the desk, and said, "The affection enhancer and compulsion traces are both still present and identifiable." A qualified potions chemist could verify the compound profile against the Rosier signature documentation in the appendix. McGonagall looked at the vial. Looked at the notebooks. Looked at Hermione. "How long have you been working on this?" she said. 3 weeks, Hermione said. "Since the first day." Something moved in McGonagall's face, not surprise, exactly. More like a recalibration. Like a person updating an estimate. "And you've told no other faculty member?" "No. I needed to understand who was safe to tell first." Hermione met her eyes steadily. "I needed to be sure you weren't connected to any of the 43 families." The silence was very precise. "I see," McGonagall said. "You're not." "I checked." Another pause. "You checked." Luna's notebooks cross-reference board connections, ministry connections, and known social alliances going back 20 years. "Your name doesn't appear in any relevant context." She paused. "You also look at Harry like he's a student, not a resource." "I noticed that in the first week." McGonagall was quiet for a long moment. She picked up the dark green notebook and opened it to the names and families section and read in silence, turning pages with a care that told Hermione she understood what she was looking at. She read for 4 minutes, Hermione counted. Then she set it down and looked at the evidence vial, and then she looked out the window at the October grounds, and her jaw was very tight. "Miss Granger," she said, "I'm going to tell you something that I would ordinarily consider inappropriate to share with a first-year student. I'm going to tell you because you have earned the right to the information and because you will find it out anyway, and I would rather you have it from someone who will give it to you straight." She turned back. "I have suspected, for some years, that something of this nature was occurring. I had fragments. Concerns. Nothing I could document, nothing I could take to Albus or the board and make stick." Her voice was measured, but there was something very tightly controlled underneath it. "I raised it once, in 1989, informally, with a colleague I trusted. The conversation went nowhere and the colleague left the school the following year under circumstances I have always found suspicious." Hermione wrote that down. McGonagall watched her do it and didn't object. "I need access to the restricted section," Hermione said. "Specifically the Historical Records Archive. Potions-related incident documentation from 1850 onward." "I know what's in there," McGonagall said. "Can you get me in?" McGonagall looked at her for a long moment. "I can write you a research note. I will list it as supervised independent study for an accelerated transfiguration project, which will be suspicious to no one because your work in class already suggests you don't need the standard first-year curriculum." She pulled out parchment and a quill. "You will tell me what you find as you find it. And you will not act on anything in those records without consulting me first." "Unless time is critical," Hermione said. McGonagall's quill paused. She looked up. Unless time is critical, she agreed, and went back to writing. The note was signed and sealed and in Hermione's hand by 7:30 in the morning. She was in the restricted section by 8. The Historical Records Archive occupied a small locked room off the main restricted corridor that Madame Pants opened for her with the expression of someone who respected the process even while clearly wanting to know what was happening. The room smelled like sealed parchment and something faintly medicinal. The records were organized by decade, then year, then incident type, the filing system of a very old institution that had once been meticulous and had gradually stopped updating its indexing without stopping its filing, which meant the older records were beautifully organized and the more recent ones were technically there but required some excavation. She found the potions incident records and started at 1850. She was there for 6 hours. Harry brought her lunch, which she ate while reading without looking up. By the time Madame Pants gently indicated that the library was closing at 9 in the evening, she had filled 31 pages of notebook with documented incidents, dates, names, and case outcomes. She had found records of 41 additional cases, not all confirmed, not all fully documented, but enough to establish that what Luna had catalogued in the contemporary period was the latest expression of something that went back over a century. There were names that repeated across generations. Families that appeared in incident records in 1910 and then again in 1952 and then again in 1978 and then again in present documentation. The same families. Different children. Same methods. The Rosier signature appeared in records as early as 1923. She sat in the corridor outside the restricted section after Madame Pants locked it, cross-legged on the floor with her notebook on her lap, and she thought about generational practice. About something done so consistently and so quietly for so long that it had stopped being a crime and become a tradition. About the families who had done this in 1923 and whose grandchildren were doing it now and whose great-grandchildren would presumably do it in another generation if nothing stopped them. Something settled in her. Something cold and very clear. She went to find the others. The document they sent to Weatherwick the following Sunday was 47 pages. It included Luna's appendix, Harry and Neville's accounts, Hermione's structural argument, the Ministry's non-response, and an addendum of 18 pages derived from the restricted section records, which she cited as Hogwarts Historical Archive, not specifying how she'd accessed them, which was technically accurate and practically protective. Luna's father sent it via 3 separate owls to 3 separate forwarding addresses, which she explained was her father's standard practice for anything he expected might be intercepted, and Hermione had accepted this with the growing understanding that the Lovegoods had been fighting a quieter version of this same fight for longer than she'd been alive. Then they waited. It was a Tuesday when the article ran. She didn't know it had run until breakfast. She came down from the dormitory at 7:15 and found the Great Hall was different, a specific kind of different that had nothing to do with the room itself, but with the density of attention in it. The way 150 people all reading or having read the same thing creates a particular ambient frequency, or raised shoulders, lowered voice quality that you feel before you understand it. Harry was already at the table, and he was reading something. Ron was beside him reading the same page, and his expression was the one Ron wore when he was genuinely alarmed, not the performed alarm of someone enjoying a drama, but real, that slightly pale quality around the nose. Hermione sat down. Harry handed her the paper without speaking. It wasn't the Prophet. It was smaller, a 6-page broadsheet on cream paper with the quill in modest lettering at the top and, below it, in the kind of headline that doesn't shout because it doesn't need to, Love Potions, Old Money, and a Ministry that looked away, the 43 Families D, Weatherwick's byline. Beneath the headline, a subheading, Documentation, First-hand Accounts, and a History of Institutional Suppression. What 7 decades of evidence looks like when someone finally adds it up. She read it. Weatherwick had used everything. He had organized it brilliantly, starting with Harry's account from the train, which had the immediate narrative pull of something specific and identifiable happening to someone everyone knew, then widening outward to Neville, then to Luna's broader documentation, then to the historical records, And finally landing on the Ministry connection and the 1978 review with the precision of someone who had spent 40 years knowing where to put the point. He had named names. Not all 43, he'd withheld the probable cases and a handful of the confirmed ones pending further verification, but enough. 12 families named directly, with their documented involvement. Malfoy was on the list. Parkinson. Avery. Knott. Rosier. 7 others. Hermione read it twice. It was good. It was very good. Better than good, it was the kind of journalism that was difficult to ignore because it didn't ask you to believe anything, it just presented documented evidence and then stepped back and let the evidence breathe. She set the paper down and picked up her porridge and ate it, because she needed to eat, and because the thing she was feeling was large enough that she needed something ordinary to do while she felt it. Across the table, Neville was reading his own copy with the particular stillness of someone reading their own name in print. She could tell by the way his eyes had stopped moving that he'd found it. He looked up and found her looking at him and she nodded and he nodded back. His expression was complicated and she didn't try to simplify it. The owls started arriving at 9:30. The first wave was letters, to Harry, mostly, but also, to her considerable surprise, addressed to Hermione Granger, first year, Gryffindor. Howlers arrived in the second wave. 2 of them, both addressed to Harry. 1 red envelope addressed to Hermione. The hall had that particular quality of held breath that meant everyone was watching and pretending not to. Harry looked at his howlers. He looked at Hermione. "Open yours first," he said. "So they see how it's done." She picked up her red envelope, which was vibrating slightly the way howlers do when they're carrying something particularly emphatic, and she opened it. The voice that came out was a woman's, controlled, aristocratic, and incandescent with rage, each word placed with the precision of someone accustomed to being listened to. It named Hermione by name. It referred to her as a muggle-born child with no understanding of wizarding tradition. It used the phrase irresponsible fabrication and the phrase dangerous interference and the phrase you will regret this in a sequence that was clearly intended to culminate in something intimidating. The hall was completely silent. Hermione listened to the whole thing without moving. She held the howler in both hands and let it finish, and when it was done she set the remnants down on the table, which smoked slightly at the edges, and she looked up at the hall, at 400 faces watching her, and she said, clearly enough to be heard at the Ravenclaw table, without raising her voice, "A woman who uses her full title to shout at an 11-year-old in a school dining room has already told you everything you need to know about her judgment." She turned back to her porridge. The silence lasted for 1 more second and then broke into approximately 6 different conversations simultaneously, and somewhere near the Hufflepuff table someone laughed and then tried to stop and couldn't. Harry opened his first howler, which was shorter and angrier and less articulate, a man's voice this time, and he let it finish and then said nothing at all, just folded the remains very precisely and put them in his pocket, and the gesture of that, the particular deliberate tidiness of someone refusing to give the thing more space than it deserved, was somehow more effective than anything he could have said. Neville's howler arrived at 11. He was in herbology when it found him. Howlers could locate recipients anywhere in the school, which had always struck Hermione as a design flaw, and they heard about it afterward, from Neville himself, who appeared at lunch with dirt on his robes and an expression she didn't have an immediate word for. He sat down across from her and said, "It was my grandmother." She waited. She said I'd made a fool of the Longbottom name. She said I should have come to her before going to the press. She said the Parkinsons are a good family and I had misrepresented what occurred. He said all of this in a very level voice. Then he said, "She knows about the cordial." She said I misrepresented it. Not that it wasn't real. That's an important distinction, Hermione said immediately. Yeah. He picked up his fork, set it down. She knows it happened and she thinks I was wrong to say anything about it. He looked at Hermione. I'm not wrong. No, she said. You're not. He nodded and picked up his fork again and ate, and he was sitting straighter than she had seen him sit before, which she noted and said nothing about because pointing it out would be the wrong move. The day developed. By afternoon, it was clear that the article had spread well beyond the students who'd seen it at breakfast. The owls kept coming, from ministry addresses and family solicitors and what appeared to be several newspaper editors who wanted follow-up, and one letter addressed to Harry in handwriting Hermione didn't recognize until Harry read it and went very still. "Who is it?" she said. He handed it to her. It was from Sirius Black, who was, the letter explained briefly, Harry's godfather, freed from Azkaban 3 weeks prior after 12 years of wrongful imprisonment, currently staying somewhere he didn't specify in the letter. He had read the article. He said, in language that was economical and slightly rough-edged in the way of someone who had spent a long time in a place that didn't encourage elegance, that he was proud. That he would help in whatever way he could from wherever he currently was. That Harry's parents would have been, and then the handwriting changed pressure slightly, and he'd written furious and then crossed it out and written extraordinarily proud instead, and then at the bottom, watch your back and don't let the bastards bore you down. More soon. Hermione read it twice and handed it back. He's useful, she said. Harry was looking at the letter with an expression she'd seen once before, on the first night on the train, when she'd confirmed that nothing in the suites had actually worked on him. The particular look of someone who has been waiting a long time for something to be real and is now holding the evidence. Yeah, he said. The ministry's response arrived the following morning in the form of a formal notice delivered to Headmaster Dumbledore and copied, apparently, to several other parties. She knew this because McGonagall found her in the corridor between charms and lunch and said, with an expression that was professionally controlled and personally quite satisfied, that Albus had received an emergency communication requesting that the students responsible for the Quill article be identified and that the source documents be surrendered to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement immediately. What did he say? Hermione asked. He said he would look into the matter, McGonagall said. Which means nothing and everyone knows it means nothing. She paused. He also asked me if I knew anything about it. I told him I had given you a library access note for an accelerated transfiguration project. Hermione looked at her. Technically accurate, McGonagall said, with the ghost of something that might have been a smile if the circumstances had been lighter, and walked away. The meeting was called for 3 o'clock. She found out about it through 2 different routes, a note from McGonagall and a breathless appearance by Ron in the Transfiguration corridor, who had apparently been talking to his father via the flow in Dumbledore's study, which was a privilege Percy had arranged and which Ron had used to call his father the moment the article ran. Dad's been in emergency meetings all day, Ron said. Someone filed a formal complaint with the DMLE naming the 12 families in the article and Dad says there are 3 departments fighting over jurisdiction and someone senior got shouted at in a corridor, which apparently never happens. He paused for breath. Dad says whoever filed the complaint did it before the ministry could organize a suppression, which means now it's on record officially and they can't just make it disappear. Hermione had filed the complaint. She'd done it the night before the article ran, by sending a formal written complaint addressed to the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, timed, with Luna's father's help, to arrive 1 hour before the paper hit the breakfast tables. By the time the ministry had read the complaint and wanted to know who had filed it, the article was already in 400 homes. She had learned this from the detective novel too. The chapter on evidence preservation. Who filed it? Ron said. Do you know? She didn't answer, which was an answer, and Ron's eyes went wide. Hermione, he said. The meeting, she said. Tell me about the meeting. Emergency session of, Dad said it was being called as an emergency consultation between 3 ministry departments and they're inviting representation from the families mentioned in the article and the complaint. Official ministry chambers at 3. He looked at her. It's at the ministry. Harry appeared behind Ron, which meant he'd been listening from around the corner, which she'd been aware of. We're going, Harry said. We're not invited, she said. We're going anyway, he said. She thought about this for exactly 4 seconds. We'll need flu access, she said. Who has it? Dumbledore's study, Ron said immediately. Then he looked alarmed at himself. I mean, I don't know if we're supposed to. I'll handle Dumbledore, Hermione said. She knocked on the headmaster's door at 1:30. He was expecting her. Somehow, she had the feeling he was usually expecting whoever came to his door, which was either a function of genuine intelligence or a performance of it, and she hadn't decided which yet. He was sitting behind his desk with his half-moon glasses and his particular quality of benign attentiveness that she found increasingly complicated the more she looked at it. "Miss Granger," he said. "I imagine you'd like to discuss this morning's rather eventful news." "I'd like to use your flue to attend the 3 o'clock ministry meeting," she said, because she didn't have time for the circuitous version. He looked at her over his glasses. "That meeting is not open to students. The meeting concerns evidence primarily collected and documented by students, regarding crimes committed against students. We have standing." She met his gaze directly. "You could argue we have more standing than half the people who will be there." He was quiet for a moment. "It's a complicated situation, Miss Granger." "Yes," she said. "It's been complicated for 70 years, which is part of the problem." Another pause. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read, which was unusual. She was generally good at reading expressions, and she held his gaze and waited. "I knew," he said, at last, "that something like this existed. I had indications. Insufficient certainty to act on." "Insufficient certainty," she repeated, very carefully. "These are powerful families. The political cost of a wrongly aimed accusation, 45 confirmed victims," she said. "That's what insufficient certainty looks like from the other end." He took his glasses off and looked at them in his hand, and she watched the weight of that land on him, and she was not without sympathy. She believed he was a person who had made choices he thought were the right trade-offs and was now confronting the gap between trade-off reasoning and actual consequence. But sympathy and permission were different things, and she needed one from him and felt the other for him, and they were not in conflict. "The flue is at your disposal," he said at last. "Take whoever you need." She took Harry and Neville. Luna, when informed, appeared from a corridor she may have been waiting in and said, "I'd like to come," and Hermione said, "Obviously," and that was that. They arrived at the ministry at 10 minutes to 3, stepping out of a public visitor flue in the atrium, all 4 of them, first years in school robes, which caused an immediate and gratifying disruption of a small crowd of ministry officials who clearly had not anticipated children in the atrium on this particular afternoon. A man in neat official robes with a lanyard that said Department of Magical Law Enforcement, senior officer stepped forward and said, "These chambers are not, you're not, Hermione Granger," she said. "I filed the complaint. This is Harry Potter, who is a primary victim and the individual on whom the initial evidence was found. This is Neville Longbottom, a documented victim of sustained potion use by the Parkinson family. And this is Luna Lovegood, who collected and verified the primary documentation for approximately 90% of what's in the Quill article." She looked at him steadily. "We're the reason there's a meeting today. I think we should probably be at it." The man opened his mouth and closed it. Luna said, very pleasantly, "Also my father is waiting outside with a photographer from 3 different publications who are interested in whether children who filed a formal ministry complaint were refused entry to the hearing about that complaint." The man closed his mouth again and looked very tired. "This way," he said. The chambers were large and wood-paneled and smelled like official decisions and old ink. There were 12 ministry officials around a central table and a separate section for what were clearly family representatives, solicitors and family heads, the latter identifiable by the specific quality of expensive stillness that old money wore like a second set of robes. Hermione clocked them in the first 30 seconds, a Parkinson representative, a Knott, an Avery, 2 she didn't recognize, and across the table, sitting separately from the family section and looking directly at nothing, a woman she recognized from a wizarding photograph Ron had shown her once, explaining who was who. Narcissa Malfoy. She was there alone, without a family solicitor, which was either a statement or a strategy, and her expression was the expression of someone who had decided exactly what they were going to do and were waiting for the moment to do it. Their entrance stopped the room. There was a long moment where everyone looked at four children in school robes standing in the doorway of an emergency ministry hearing, and then a ministry official at the head of the table, Bartemius Crouch, Sr., Hermione noted from the nameplate, said, "This session is closed to non-ministry personnel." "Then it should also be closed to the family representatives," Hermione said, walking to the open section of the table and sitting down, "since none of them work for the ministry." Crouch looked at her with the expression of someone who had not expected to encounter 11-year-old logic and was recalibrating. The others sat down. Harry to Hermione's right, Neville to her left, Luna at the end with her notebooks already open. "Miss," Crouch began. "Granger," she said. "I'm the one who filed the formal complaint you're here to discuss. I have the original documentation. I also have," she placed the vial on the table, "the primary physical evidence, which has not been surrendered to this department because we don't yet have confirmation of the independence of the relevant DMLE personnel." She looked at him. "Which I think you'll agree is a reasonable precaution given the 1978 suppression." The silence was extraordinary. One of the family solicitors said, sharply, "This is outrageous, these children have no, Mr. Caro," Crouch said, in the voice of someone managing a situation that had departed from the anticipated script and was now moving under its own momentum, "Please allow, she's a Muggle-born first year who has made unsubstantiated, 45 confirmed victims," Harry said. He said it exactly as quietly as Hermione had said it to Dumbledore, with exactly the same absence of performance. "Documented. Named. With physical evidence." He looked at Caro. "What part of that is unsubstantiated?" Caro mouth closed. Narcissa Malfoy, from her separate seat, turned her head and looked at Harry for a long moment. Then she looked at Hermione. Her gaze was precise and comprehensive, the look of someone cataloging information, and Hermione returned it with equal steadiness. The hearing went for 2 hours. Hermione spoke when it was useful to speak and was quiet when it wasn't, which was a discipline she was still developing but which she had found was more effective than constant contribution. A few precisely placed facts were worth more than continuous argument. Luna provided technical verification when the ministry chemist assigned to the session asked specific compound questions, answering them with the appendix open, citing page and line with the calm authority of someone who had been preparing for this conversation for 2 years. Neville, when asked directly about his experience, spoke with a plainness that was devastating in exactly the way his written account had been. Harry said almost nothing for the first hour and a half. He sat, and he listened, and he watched the family representatives with his green eyes and that particular stillness, and when the Avery representative made the case that insufficient chain of custody for the physical evidence made it inadmissible, Harry said, quietly, "I can describe every detail of the bag, the visit, and the effects. I'm the chain of custody. I was there." The argument about admissibility stopped. By the end of the second hour, 2 things had been agreed upon. A formal independent investigation was to be opened by a subdepartment of the DMLE that had no current staffing connections to the cited families, and a preliminary injunction had been placed on the 7 most clearly documented cases preventing the families from contact with the relevant victims pending investigation. It was not everything. It was not a conviction. It was not the complete dismantling of anything. But it was on record. It was official. It had been agreed to in a room where all 12 families would have preferred it not to be, and it could not now be made to disappear. Walking back through the atrium toward the visitor floor, Luna's father found them, a mild-mannered man with the same large eyes as his daughter, who embraced Luna briefly and then shook hands with Harry, Neville, and Hermione with the specific warmth of someone who knew exactly what had just been done and what it had cost. "The article had 12,000 readers by noon," he said. "Weatherwick says the letters to the editor are running 4-to-1 in support. He's planning a follow-up for next week. Tell him we'll have more documentation ready," Hermione said. "I rather suspected you'd say that." Xenophilius Lovegood smiled. "Luna has told me about you, Miss Granger," she said. He glanced at his daughter. "She said you were the person she'd been waiting for." Hermione looked at Luna, who was examining a wanted poster on the atrium wall with apparent interest and complete innocence. Tell him about the restricted section records, Hermione said. The historical pattern. That's the follow-up. Not the hearing today, the fact that this has been happening for 100 years and being covered up for most of that. Xenophilius nodded. I will. They took the Floo back to Hogwarts. Hermione stepped out into Dumbledore's study and found McGonagall there. She had not been there when they left, which meant she'd been informed and had come, and her expression said she'd been waiting with something between professional restraint and frank worry. Well, she said. Formal investigation opened, Hermione said. 7 families under preliminary injunction. DMLE subdepartment assigned, independent staffing. She brushed soot off her robes. Not enough. But it's a start. McGonagall looked at her for a long moment. You walked into a ministry emergency session uninvited, she said. Yes. With 3 other first years. Yes. And they let you stay. We had standing, Hermione said. They couldn't justify removing us without proving exactly what we were alleging about how the system protects itself. McGonagall was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Go and have dinner. You look as though you haven't eaten since breakfast. She hadn't, as it happened. She went to dinner. The Great Hall was different again, another register of collective awareness, denser now, carrying the specific charged quality of people who have been following a story all day and are waiting for the next development. News traveled fast in a school. By dinner everyone knew there had been a ministry hearing. By dessert everyone knew they had attended it. Draco Malfoy looked at their table once during the meal. Not at Harry. At Hermione. His expression was unreadable and she didn't try to read it. She ate her dinner, and she thought about the 2 families in the hearing that she hadn't been able to identify, and she thought about the Rosier compound signature and records going back to 1923, and she thought about what a formal investigation opened under political pressure actually looked like versus what it was supposed to look like, and she wrote 2 things in her notebook. First, monitor investigation independence. Check assigned personnel against Luna's ministry connections list within the week. Second, because she had been thinking about it since the hearing, since the moment Narcissa Malfoy had looked at her with that precise, cataloging attention, she's going to make contact. Soon. The question is what she wants. She underlined the second one. Put a star beside it. Outside the castle windows, the October dark had come down completely, and the lake was invisible except for a dim reflection of tower lights on the water. Neville was talking to Harry about something. She caught the word grandmother and let them have the conversation without inserting herself. Luna was reading, as she almost always was, though she glanced up once and met Hermione's eyes across the table with the particular look she had for important things. Hermione nodded. Tomorrow there would be more to do. There would always be more to do, that was the nature of what they'd started. It didn't have a natural resting point short of actual structural change, and she was realistic enough to know that structural change was measured in years, not weeks. But the formal complaint was filed and could not be unfiled. The article had 12,000 readers and was going to have more. The ministry had opened an investigation in a room full of witnesses and that was on public record. Something had been set in motion that was larger than an evidence vial and a notebook. She could feel the difference. The weight of it. The way the ground had shifted slightly underfoot. She finished her dessert and closed her notebook and picked up her bag, and as she stood to leave the hall, the Howler woman's voice came back to her, "You will regret this," and she thought about 45 names and a cordial that tasted like nothing wrong and a green bag left in a boy's trunk like it was supposed to be there. No, she thought. I really don't think I will. Chapter 5, Narcissa's Gambit. She came on a Wednesday. Hermione knew she was in the castle before anyone told her, because the castle changed when Narcissa Malfoy walked into it, not dramatically, not in any way that would register unless you were paying attention to the quality of how people moved around her. But conversations lowered. Postures adjusted. Teachers who passed her in the entrance hall nodded with a fraction more deference than the situation required, the involuntary recalibration of people in proximity to someone they understood, on some level, to be dangerous. Hermione was crossing the entrance hall at 10:30, on her way back from a free period in the library, when she saw her. Narcissa was standing near the foot of the main staircase talking to Professor Slughorn, who was performing the particular social gymnastics of a man delighted to be in the company of someone significant while simultaneously trying to look like he was there by coincidence. She was in traveling robes, charcoal gray, understated, expensive in a way that required knowing what to look for, and she was listening to Slughorn with a polite attention that gave nothing away. Her hair was pale and precisely arranged. Her hands were still. She looked, Hermione thought, like a woman who had decided exactly what was going to happen today and was simply waiting for the world to catch up with her decision. Their eyes met across the entrance hall. Narcissa's attention moved from Slughorn to Hermione with no more visible transition than a change in window light, and for 3 seconds she simply looked, doing that comprehensive cataloguing that Hermione remembered from the ministry hearing. Then she said something brief to Slughorn that ended the conversation smoothly enough that he probably thought he'd concluded it himself, and she walked across the entrance hall toward Hermione. Hermione didn't move. "Miss Granger," Narcissa said. "I wonder if you'd be willing to speak with me." Her voice was measured and precise. It was the voice of someone who chose every word before it left her mouth and put each one exactly where she wanted it. "Certainly," Hermione said. "Though I should tell you that I'll be making notes." Something moved in Narcissa's face, not surprise, not irritation. It was closer to assessment. The look of a chess player who has just watched an opponent do something unexpected and is revising their understanding of the board. "Of course," she said. They found an empty classroom off the second-floor corridor, the kind of room that smelled like chalk dust and wasn't used on Wednesday mornings. Hermione took the chair behind the teacher's desk, which was not a subtle choice, and opened her notebook. Narcissa sat in a student chair in the front row and appeared completely undisturbed by the configuration. The door was open. Hermione had made sure of that. "I'll come directly to it," Narcissa said. "Please," Hermione said. "I want the Malfoy name removed from the formal investigation. In exchange, I'll provide sworn testimony against 4 other families, names you don't yet have, with evidence more substantial than anything in your current documentation. These are families involved in practices significantly more serious than what's been publicly reported, and I have first-hand knowledge of their methodology and their supply chains." She looked at Hermione steadily. "I understand you want the full picture. I'm offering you a significant portion of it." Hermione wrote Malfoy removal plus testimony for unnamed families plus supply chain evidence in her notebook. She underlined supply chain evidence twice. Then she looked up. "Why?" "I'm protecting my family." "From the investigation or from what the investigation will find?" The pause was very brief. "Both," Narcissa said, which was honest in a way that Hermione had not expected and which she updated accordingly. "What did the investigation find about the Malfoys specifically that you're trying to contain?" "Nothing yet. But they will find things." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to, the fact that she was here at all was the elaboration. Hermione thought for a moment. She looked at what she'd written. She thought about what supply chain evidence meant, the actual manufacturing and distribution networks, the people who made these compounds and moved them between families, which was the piece of the puzzle that had been frustratingly absent from everything they had so far. Names and victims were one kind of evidence. Supply chain was something else. Supply chain evidence could dismantle the infrastructure, not just prosecute the individual instances. She could feel the pull of it. She understood why Narcissa had led with it. She put her quill down. "I'm going to tell you why I'm going to say no," she said. "And I want you to listen carefully, because I'm going to be completely honest with you, which I think is more than you expected." Narcissa's expression didn't change but her attention sharpened perceptibly. "The testimony you're offering is valuable," Hermione said. "The supply chain information is probably the most useful thing we don't have yet. I recognize that. You came here with real currency." She paused. But if I remove the Malfoy name from the investigation in exchange for testimony, I've established that the outcome of this investigation is negotiable. That names can be bought off it. That the right offer makes the right family safe. She met Narcissa's eyes. And the moment that's true, every family on the list is going to find out what the price is. And families with more money and more connections than you have will pay it. And what started as an investigation into systematic harm to children becomes a closed-door auction. Narcissa said nothing. I also need to tell you, Hermione continued, that removing your family doesn't actually protect Draco. The Malfoy family's presence in this investigation is based on documented evidence, which exists independently of whether his name is on a ministry list. If Lucius Malfoy used compulsion chemistry on his own son, which the documentation suggests, then removing the family's name from an official investigation doesn't undo that fact. It just means no one in authority is looking at it. She paused. Which means it continues. Something happened in Narcissa's face. It was small and well controlled, but Hermione caught it, a very brief fracture in the composure, the look of a person hearing something they already knew articulated in a way that removed the comfortable distance from it. Draco is, Narcissa started. He was dosed, Hermione said, quietly but directly. By his own family. To make him a better social instrument. I don't know if you were the one who decided that, or if you knew about it, or if you were told it was something else, but the result is the same. And taking his family off the investigation list doesn't undo 3 years of it. It just means he has to figure out on his own what it did to him. She held Narcissa's gaze. That's not protection. That's a different kind of damage. The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere on the floor above them, a class was being dismissed, the shuffle and voices of students moving through a corridor, then fading. Narcissa looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap with a stillness that had cost something. She looked at them for a long time. You're 11 years old, she said, at last. Yes, Hermione said. You walked into a ministry emergency session uninvited and made Bartemius Crouch sit down. Technically he was already sitting. Narcissa looked up. Something had changed in her expression, not softened, not defeated, but shifted. The chess player again, but revising more substantially this time. What do you want from me, then? If not the deal I've offered. I want the same thing, Hermione said. The testimony and the supply chain evidence. I want all of it. I want the 4 families and the names and the methodology and the distribution networks. She leaned forward slightly. But not in exchange for removing your family from the investigation. In exchange for the investigation treating your family's cooperation as significant mitigating evidence in whatever proceedings follow. Which it would be. Genuinely. She paused. I'm not offering you safety from the investigation. I'm offering you the difference between a family that cooperated and provided information and a family that didn't. That's a real difference. In outcomes, in the public record, in what this looks like in 10 years. Narcissa was still. The other offer is better for you in the short term, Hermione said. Mine is better for your family long term. And for Draco specifically. She paused. I think you know that. I think that's why you're still sitting here. Narcissa looked at her for a long moment with an expression Hermione was going to be unpacking for weeks afterward, something that was not warmth but was not quite its opposite either, the look of one very capable person recognizing another and finding the recognition more complicated than expected. I need to think about it, Narcissa said. Take your time, Hermione said. The investigation is still in its first week. But not too much time. Narcissa stood. She smoothed her robes in a gesture that was either habit or something she needed to do. At the door she paused, one hand on the frame, not looking back, and said, the supply chain goes through a potions laboratory in Yorkshire. It's not a Rosier operation. The Rosiers are manufacturers but they're not distributors. Someone else has been running the distribution for the last 20 years and they're very careful and they've never appeared in any documentation. She paused. That's not the deal. That's free information. To show you I'm serious. She left. Hermione sat for a long moment in the empty classroom. The chalk dust smell. The quiet. She wrote Yorkshire Laboratory, distribution separate from Rosier Manufacture, 20 years, unknown operator in her notebook and underlined all of it and sat with what it meant. Then she closed the notebook, picked up her bag, and went to find Harry. He was in the courtyard with Ron, who was attempting to teach him something involving exploding snap that kept exploding more than either of them intended. She sat on the wall next to them and told them everything, the conversation, the offer, what she'd said, what Narcissa had said at the door. Harry listened without expression. When she finished, he said, "You didn't take the deal." "No." "Good." He caught a card that had just launched itself into the air. "If we'd taken it, everyone would have known within a week." "Yes." "And the Yorkshire thing," he said. "She gave that away freely." "To establish credibility," Hermione said. "To show she has what she says she has. But also," she paused, working something through. "I think she genuinely doesn't know whether she's going to give us the rest. I think she came here with the deal prepared and the deal fell apart in a way she didn't expect and now she's trying to decide what she actually wants to do." She looked at her notebook. "Which means there's still a real chance she cooperates. She's just not ready to commit." Ron had stopped playing cards and was looking at her with an expression of undisguised bewilderment. "You're 11, he said. "So I've been told," she said. Luna appeared at the courtyard entrance. She had a quality of arriving at relevant moments that Hermione had stopped questioning because it happened consistently enough to just be a feature of Luna, and she said, without preamble, "Draco Malfoy has been waiting outside Professor McGonagall's office for 40 minutes. All three of them looked at her. "He doesn't have an appointment," Luna said. "Neville saw him and told me. He's sitting on the bench outside her door with a piece of parchment in his hands and he looks like someone who's made a decision they're not sure they're allowed to make." Hermione thought about the corridor outside the restricted section. The flash of white blonde hair. Narcissa in the entrance hall, here ostensibly for a parental visit, having had a conversation with Hermione that had gone differently from expected. She thought about what a boy does when his mother comes to school to manage a situation that involves him, and he overhears enough of it to understand what's being managed, and he has a piece of parchment in his hands. "What's on the parchment?" she said. "Neville said it looked like a list," Luna said. Hermione stood up. She found Draco in the corridor outside McGonagall's office, exactly as Luna had described, sitting on the bench, parchment in both hands, wearing the specific expression of someone in the middle of doing something they can't undo. He heard her footsteps and looked up, and for a moment his face went through a rapid and uncharacteristic sequence of expressions before settling on the familiar cool blankness. "Granger," he said. "Malfoy," she said, and sat down on the bench beside him, which clearly startled him because he shifted slightly away in an involuntary and immediately regretted movement. "I'm waiting for McGonagall," he said. "I know," she said. "About what?" "That's none of your..." He stopped. Looked at the parchment. Looked away. "It's personal." "Is it the list?" He looked at her sharply. She watched him calculate how she could know about the list, and she watched him arrive at the answer, Neville, who had seen him, who had told Luna, who had told her, and she watched his expression do something complicated. "Luna Lovegood should mind her own business," he said, without any particular heat. "Luna Lovegood has been minding this business for 2 years, Hermione said. "It sort of is her business at this point." He said nothing. He looked at the parchment and then at the floor and she let the silence run because pressuring Draco Malfoy was not the right method. He was someone who had spent his whole life in a family that applied pressure as a primary instrument, and adding more would just make him close up. After a while, he said, without looking at her, "There are names on this list that aren't in the documentation." She waited. "Children," he said, tightly. "Kids I know from the summer circuits. Events my parents take me to." He turned the parchment over and back again. I've seen it happen. Not to all of them. But some of them. He finally looked at her, and his expression was not what she expected, not the performance of disdain, not the careful composure. It was the look of someone who had been angry about something for a long time and was exhausted by the management of it. I'm not, this isn't me being noble. He stopped. I know what it feels like. When things are done to you and you're expected to be grateful because it's the family deciding it. I know you know, she said, quietly. His jaw tightened. I wasn't in your documentation. You're in Luna's background notes, she said honestly. Not in the evidence section. In the observation section. She paused. You don't have to be in the investigation if you don't want to be. That's your choice. But if you want to give us the names, I want to give you the names, he said. Blunt. Final. The sound of a decision already fully made. I was going to give them to McGonagall. But you'll use them better. Probably, she said, which was honest. He handed her the parchment. There were 9 names. She read them, recognized 3 from previous documentation in peripheral contexts, and noted 6 new ones. Beside 4 of the names he had written specific details, family names, compound descriptions where he'd been close enough to recognize, dates that were exact enough to suggest he had been keeping his own records, quietly, for some time. Did you write these down as they happened? She said. I have a good memory, he said, in the tone of someone stating a fact they don't particularly want to be credited for. So does Harry, she said. A strange look crossed his face. Are you comparing me to? I'm noting that both of you had the presence of mind to retain information in situations where most people would have just been frightened, she said. It's not an insult. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, my mother came here today. I know. Did you take her deal? No. He looked at the floor again. Something in his posture, not relaxed, exactly, but slightly less armored. What did you offer her instead? She told him. Exactly what she'd said to Narcissa, the mitigating evidence versus the removal from investigation, the distinction between short-term protection and long-term consequence. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. She'll do it, he said at last. The thing you offered. She'll take it. He said it with the confidence of someone who knew the person in question very well and was reading the decision from context. She wants to protect the family, but she doesn't actually believe in most of it. The things they do. It's the water she swims in. He paused. That doesn't make it acceptable. No, Hermione said. It doesn't. I know that, he said, slightly sharply. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm just explaining what you're dealing with. I appreciate it, she said, and meant it. He stood, tucked the now empty hand into his pocket, and looked at her with an expression that was the most unguarded she'd seen from him. What happens to the families, he said. In the end. If this all goes how you want. Legal proceedings for the confirmed cases, she said. Law reform, the existing statutes are insufficient and the enforcement mechanisms have specific gaps that need closing. The families with the deepest institutional connections will fight hard and some of them will probably avoid the worst consequences. She paused. But the practice gets exposed. Systematically. Publicly. With a documented history that can't be buried again because it's in newspapers and legal records and 4 sets of notebooks held by 4 different people in 4 different places. She looked at him. The water changes. It gets harder to swim in. He nodded slowly. Then he turned to go. Malfoy, she said. He stopped. If it becomes relevant, if you need it, what you just gave me is going to be in the documentation as voluntarily provided testimony. Your name will be on it as a contributor, not a subject. She held his gaze. That's not nothing. In the public record. It's actually quite significant. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You work very fast for a first year," and walked away down the corridor, and she was fairly sure she had seen the ghost of something in his expression that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to the feeling that produces smiles, and she filed it and picked up her notebook and went to find Harry and Neville. She found them in the great hall at lunch, Luna already there, and she sat down and put the parchment on the table. 9 new names, she said. Draco Malfoy. The silence was the good kind, the kind that means everyone at the table is processing the significance of something. He just gave it to you? Ron said. He'd made the decision before I got there, she said. I just collected it. Harry looked at the parchment for a moment. He didn't pick it up. Is he all right? The question was simple and genuine and she thought about it properly before answering. I think he will be, she said. He's been angry about this for a long time and he didn't have anywhere to put the anger. Now he does. Harry nodded. He picked up the parchment and read it and passed it to Neville, who read it and passed it to Luna, who read it and immediately began cross-referencing 2 of the names in her notes with the satisfied focus of someone completing a pattern. Hermione ate her lunch and watched the hall and thought about the distribution network in Yorkshire, which Narcissa had given her freely to prove her credibility. 20 years. Unknown operator, careful, never documented. While the Rosiers manufactured and the named families used, someone else had been running the logistics, taking orders, moving compounds, maintaining the chain between maker and end user, and that person had been invisible the entire time. That was the piece that most unsettled her. Because if you dismantled every named family and prosecuted every documented case and reformed every relevant law and the distribution operator was still running, the infrastructure for what came next was already in place. The network could reconstitute around new players. Different families, same methodology, same invisible supply chain. You had to get the whole thing. She wrote in her notebook, Distribution Network, Yorkshire, 20 years, who is running it? She thought about it all through the afternoon. Through charms, where she cast a perfect Lumos on the first try and barely noticed. Through the walk back from class, half listening to Harry and Ron debate Quidditch tactics with the earnestness of 2 people who had recently discovered they both cared about the same thing. Through dinner, where she watched the staff table and thought about which teachers might have useful knowledge about the potion supply world. Snape, obviously. She had been thinking about Snape since Harry's note on the margin of his parchment in the second week, he knows something, and she had been watching him with that in mind since then. The complicated specific look when he saw Harry. The quality of his interest in potions chemistry that went beyond pedagogy into something more personal, the way someone teaches a subject they have their own complicated history with. His access, as a potions master, to information about compound manufacturing and distribution that most people wouldn't have. She didn't know where he stood. She didn't know if he was someone who had looked the other way or someone who had been working against it quietly in his own way or someone who was simply complicated in the vast middle ground between those 2 things. She didn't know if he'd been a victim, a participant, or an observer, and all 3 seemed genuinely possible. But she knew, from 3 months of watching, that Snape was someone who cared, fiercely, privately, with enormous investment, about the things he chose to care about. The subject of potions was one. The question was whether the misuse of potions for human manipulation was something that fell inside his circle of caring or outside it. There was only one way to find out. She went to his office after dinner. He was at his desk when she knocked and entered, reading something she couldn't see the cover of, which he closed before she was 2 steps into the room. His expression was, as usual, an exercise in controlled impassiveness. Miss Granger, he said. It is after hours. I know, she said. I won't take much time. I need to ask you something directly and I prefer to do it without an audience. He looked at her for a long moment. Sit, he said. She sat. She put her notebook on the desk but didn't open it. There is a distribution network, she said. For compulsion compounds. Not the manufacturers, we have a good picture of manufacture. The distributors. Whoever runs the logistics between the Rosier laboratories and the end users. Active for 20 years, no documentation, no trace in anything we've found. She looked at him. I think you know who it is. The silence was very long. Snape looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, not the controlled contempt or the focused pedagogy or the particular dislike he aimed at Harry. Something more considered. More careful. The look of someone deciding how much of a private map to share. What makes you think I would have that information, he said. You're a potions master with a deep knowledge of compound chemistry and you've been at this school for 10 years, she said. You move in circles that most people don't. And you look at Harry like there's a history in it. She paused. You know things. I'm not asking how or why. I'm asking what. Another long silence. He stood up, the abrupt movement of someone who processes things better in motion, and walked to the window. Outside it was fully dark, the grounds invisible beyond the glass. There is a name, he said, to the window. I will not give it to you tonight because I need to verify that my information is still current and because the name carries significant consequences. It is not one of the families you've documented. It is not a family at all. He paused. It is an individual. One person who has been managing the distribution network with considerable operational intelligence for 18 years. Longer than the 20 years Narcissa implied, she said. He glanced back at her. She said 20. Approximately. The operation began smaller, he said. The current scale developed over 18 years. The earlier period was different in character. He looked at the window again. I will need a week. To verify. To decide, he said, and the distinction was pointed. She looked at him. She thought about the complicated specific look he gave Harry and what it might contain, old guilt, old loyalty, old grief, all of the above, the weight of a person who had been standing adjacent to this kind of harm for a long time without being able to stop it or perhaps without choosing to stop it, and she didn't know which, and it mattered. Can I ask you one more thing? She said. He said nothing, which she took as permission. Did you know about Harry? Specifically. Before he arrived. The silence was the longest of the conversation. When he spoke, his voice was controlled in the way that control is a container for something else. I knew that certain parties had a significant interest in managing his relationships from the beginning, he said. I did not know the specific mechanism. I had suspicions. He paused. I did not act on them. She absorbed this. She thought about what the right response was, not the emotional response, which was complex, but the useful one. Then help us now, she said. That's all I'm asking. He didn't turn around. 1 week, Miss Granger. She stood, picked up her notebook, and left. The corridor outside was cold and dark and smelled like stone. She stood in it for a moment, thinking about distribution networks and old guilt and a woman in charcoal robes who had given her a free piece of information to demonstrate that she had more where it came from. The picture was getting bigger. She could feel it expanding, the way you feel a room is larger than you thought when the lights come on. The named families were real and their culpability was real, but they were the visible layer. Underneath them was an infrastructure, a distribution operation, 18 or 20 years old, run by one person with operational intelligence, connected to the Rosier manufacture chain, moving compounds to families across the country with no trace in any documentation. And underneath the infrastructure was something harder to name. The belief system that made all of it seem reasonable to the people who used it. The idea that certain children were commodities and that managing them was not violence but strategy. She thought about all of this and then she thought about something else. She thought about Draco sitting on the bench outside McGonagall's office with a list in his hands, looking like someone who had made a decision they weren't sure they were allowed to make. She thought about Neville saying I want to help with that new quality of stillness, the person who had been made small for years deciding he didn't have to be anymore. She thought about Harry on the train, sitting with a sealed evidence vial in someone else's hands, saying I thought it was kind about a glass of juice that had been designed to make him easy to manipulate. She thought about Luna, 12 years old, sitting on a windowsill with 4 notebooks and 2 years of documentation, waiting for the right person to come along. These were the children the system had tried to manage. Had tried to route around, or soften, or steer, or use. The system had, she thought, made a significant miscalculation. She walked back up toward Gryffindor Tower. Halfway up the 4th staircase she found Harry sitting on the steps. He did this sometimes, just sat in the castle at odd hours, and she had come to understand it was how he processed things, the movement of the building around him while he was still. "How did it go?" he said. "He needs a week," she said, sitting beside him on the steps. "He has a name." "The distributor?" "Yes." Harry looked at the moving staircase opposite them, which was drifting slowly sideways like a dreaming thing. "This is bigger than I thought it was on the train," he said. "Yes," she said. "It always was. We just couldn't see all of it yet." He was quiet. A portrait on the nearby wall shuffled in its frame, a painted witch who appeared to be sleeping, her painted chest rising and falling with the comfortable regularity of oil on canvas. "Narcissa's going to take your deal," he said. "Draco thinks so too," she said. "We'll see. What happens if she does? Supply chain evidence plus the 4 additional families plus whatever Snape gives us in a week plus the restricted section historical records, all organized into a second article for Weatherwick and a full supplementary submission to the DMLE investigation." She looked at him. "That's enough to force a public inquiry, not just a departmental investigation. A Wisengamot-level inquiry. Full oversight. Named magistrates. Public record." Harry absorbed this. "And the distribution operator. The person Snape knows. That name," she said, "goes to the inquiry directly. With full documentation. Not just the quill for public record, but also formal legal submission so it can't be reported without consequence." She paused. "If Snape gives us what I think he has, this stops being a story about families misusing chemistry and starts being a story about an organized criminal operation that has been servicing those families for 20 years. That's a different category of charge." He was quiet for a long moment. "We started with a bag of sweets on the Hogwarts Express," he said. "Yes," she said. 3 months ago." "Yes." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to associate with him saying something that mattered. "I've been thinking," he said, "about before. About all of it. The Dursleys, the way I'd just go along with things, the way I never really asked questions about my own life." He paused. "Part of that was just how I was raised. But part of it might have been the cordial on Privet Drive, multiple visits, now that I think back, multiple times someone I didn't know appeared and was kind and gave me things." "I know," she said. "The point is, I didn't know what I was like without it. I didn't have a before to compare to." He looked at the staircase again. "I think I'm finding out now." She thought about what to say, and decided that honesty was better than comfort. "You were going to be like this anyway," she said. "The observation skills. The memory. The way you make decisions. That's not post-potion Harry. That's just you." She paused. The potions didn't create someone compliant from someone who wasn't. They put a muffling layer over someone who was always going to be exactly as difficult to manage as you currently are. He laughed. "The real one, full and genuine," and it echoed a little in the stone stairwell. "Is that a compliment?" he said. "It's an accurate observation," she said. "Which, from me, is approximately the same thing." He smiled and looked at the portrait and she looked at her notebook and the castle settled around them, breathing in its old way, towers and staircases and 100 years of history embedded in the stone. She thought, 1 week. 1 week for Snape to decide. Some days for Narcissa to make her choice. Then the second submission, the second article, and whatever came after that. She was not under any illusion that it would be clean. The families with the deepest pockets would hire the best lawyers. Someone would challenge the investigation's jurisdiction. Someone else would question the chain of evidence. The ministry had already demonstrated its willingness to protect itself, and there were people inside it who would work against them. But working against them now was different from before the first article. Before the ministry hearing. Before 45 names existed in public record with a formal complaint attached. Now working against them was visible. And visible opposition to documented evidence of harm done to children was its own story, and Weatherwick was paying attention, and 12,000 readers had become considerably more in 3 weeks. She wrote one thing in her notebook before she stood up. What comes after the inquiry isn't the end. It's the next beginning. Plan accordingly. She stood, tucked the notebook under her arm, and said, "Come on. It's late and Transfiguration is at 8 and McGonagall assigns homework based on how awake you look." "How do you know that?" "I've been monitoring the correlation for 2 months." "Of course you have," Harry said, and followed her up the stairs, and the castle moved around them in the dark, old and enormous and full of things not yet uncovered, and somewhere in Yorkshire a distribution network ran quietly in the night, not yet knowing that its days of invisibility were nearly over. Chapter 6. The next beginning. Snape's information arrived in 7 days exactly. Not delivered in person, she found an envelope on her desk in the dormitory on Wednesday morning, sealed with plain wax and no identifying mark, containing 3 pages of dense, precise handwriting that had the quality of someone who had written and rewritten every sentence before committing it to parchment. No salutation, no signature. Just information, organized with the methodical care of a person who understood the difference between useful evidence and noise. The distributor's name was Thaddeus Rowe. He was not a family name. He was not a pureblood patriarch or a society figure or anyone who appeared in the social columns of the Prophet. He was, Snape's pages explained, a former potions apprentice who had studied under a Rosier associate in the late 1960s, left without completing his training under circumstances that remained officially undocumented, and spent the subsequent 2 decades building the most efficient illegal potion distribution network in Britain from a converted farmhouse in the North Riding of Yorkshire. He had no criminal record. He had no ministry file. He had been, for 18 years, the invisible connective tissue between the families who wanted these compounds and the Rosier laboratories that produced them, handling orders through a layered system of intermediaries that had kept his name off every piece of paper that had ever come close to official scrutiny. Snape had known about Rowe for 6 years. The pages did not explain how. They explained what, the general structure of the network, the names of 2 intermediaries Snape could identify, the location of the farmhouse, and a single piece of information that Hermione read 3 times before she fully understood its significance. Rowe kept records. Meticulous, comprehensive records. Every order, every family, every compound, every date, going back 18 years. He kept them because he was a careful man who understood that his records were his insurance, the guarantee that no family who used his services would ever turn him in, because turning him in meant their own names appearing in whatever investigation followed. His records were his protection and his leverage simultaneously, and he had spent 18 years making sure they stayed that way. Hermione sat on her bed in the dormitory with the 3 pages in her hands while Parvati slept across the room, and she thought about 18 years of records and what they would mean, not as evidence in the current investigation, but as the complete picture. Every transaction. Every family. Every child on the receiving end of a compound ordered through Rowe's network, documented in his own hand. Everything they needed was in a farmhouse in Yorkshire. She went downstairs, found Harry already in the common room. He was an early riser, she discovered, the habit of someone who had learned that the hours before the rest of the household woke were the safest ones, and she sat beside him and put the pages on the table. He read them. She watched his face move through each stage. He kept records, Harry said, setting the pages down. Because they protected him, she said. Do they still protect him if we know they exist? She had been thinking about this since she'd first read the line. That depends on how we move. If we go directly to the DMLE, Ro gets advance warning through whatever ministry connections the families have, and the records disappear before anyone gets there. She paused. But if we give the information to the inquiry directly, bypassing the DMLE entirely, the Weisengamot inquiry has independent access powers, they don't have to go through the department, then the records can be seized before Ro knows it's coming. Is there a Weisengamot inquiry? There will be, she said. By the end of this week. He looked at her. She told him about Narcissa. The letter had arrived the previous afternoon, formal, brief, and unambiguous. Narcissa Malfoy would provide sworn testimony against 4 families, with full documentation of her knowledge of their supply chain connections and methodology, and would additionally confirm certain information regarding the internal use of compliance chemistry within the Malfoy household. She would provide this to the DMLE investigation as cooperating testimony. In exchange, she expected the investigation record to reflect the nature and timing of her cooperation. She had not asked for the Malfoy name to be removed. She had not negotiated any further concessions. She had taken the deal Hermione had offered. 4 families, Harry said. The Flints, the Bulstrodes, the Selwyns, and one I didn't recognize, a family called McNair. She'd spent an hour in the library after receiving the letter, cross-referencing. All 4 have children currently at Hogwarts. All 4 appear in Luna's probable column. She had circumstantial evidence but nothing concrete. Narcissa's testimony moves them from probable to confirmed. Harry was quiet for a moment. How many confirmed does that make total? She had counted last night. 61. Confirmed, documented, with physical evidence or sworn testimony or both. He absorbed this. Outside the common room window, dawn was doing something tentative and gray over the grounds, the November sky the color of old pewter. And Ro's records would have more, he said. Almost certainly. The families we've documented are the ones who came to light through what we could access. Ro's customer list would be the complete picture. She picked up the pages. This is the last piece. If we get the records, there's nothing left to find, everything is either documented or documentable. So how do we force the Weisengamot inquiry? She had a plan for this and had had one since roughly 3 in the morning when she'd finished reading Snape's pages the 4th time. It required Weatherwick. It required Sirius Black. And it required doing something in public that nobody could ignore. Weatherwick first. She wrote to him that morning with the new information, not the full text of Snape's pages, which she wasn't ready to release yet, but enough to establish that a named individual ran the distribution network and that this individual maintained comprehensive records. She told him the follow-up article needed to hit on Friday, not next week, and it needed to explicitly call for a Weisengamot-level inquiry rather than a departmental one, and it needed to name the DMLE's conflict of interest by citing the personnel connections Luna had documented in the Red Notebook. She sent it via Luna's father's private owls. Sirius Black was harder, because his letters came from addresses that changed each time. He was moving frequently, she'd gathered, the particular peripatetic existence of someone who was technically free but not yet officially cleared, a situation that Harry described with a careful neutrality that didn't quite cover his feelings about it. She wrote to the most recent address anyway, explaining what they needed, which was his formal statement as Harry's godfather and legal guardian documenting that individuals unknown had accessed Harry's living situation at Privet Drive in the summer of 1991 and administered a priming compound, which constituted criminal trespass and assault under magical law. It wasn't just a statement, it was a legal instrument that tied the evidence chain directly to Harry as a minor under a named guardian's protection, which changed the category of the crime and the applicable statute significantly. She sent it and hoped he was where she'd sent it. Then she did the public thing. It was not dramatic in the way she'd thought about drama before this term, before she'd understood that the most effective version of public was not loud but rather visible and attributable and impossible to pretend you hadn't seen. The public thing she did was stand up in the Hogwarts Great Hall at breakfast on Thursday, before she had confirmation from either Weatherwick or Sirius, and ask to speak. She did not shout. She did not perform. She simply stood up and said, clearly enough that the whole hall could hear, that she wanted to read something into the public record of the school. Professor McGonagall, at the staff table, looked at her for one long moment and then said, "Go ahead, Miss Granger," which was the only permission she needed. She read the formal petition she'd drafted the previous night, addressed to the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, citing the documented evidence, the DMLE's conflict of interest as established by the personnel records, the existence of a named distribution operator with comprehensive records, and the 61 confirmed victims. It was 2 pages. She read it in full, clearly, without rushing, and the hall was completely silent for all of it. When she finished, she sat down. Harry, beside her, said nothing. He just picked up his pumpkin juice and took a drink, the gesture of someone completely comfortable with what had just happened. Neville, across the table, was sitting very straight. Luna, 4 seats down, was eating toast and looking serenely at the middle distance, as though she had always known this moment would come and had been waiting for it with the patience of someone who reads a lot. The petition was copied and sent to 3 places simultaneously that afternoon: the Wizengamot offices, the Prophet, who had been notably absent from the story so far and whose silence Hermione had always suspected was not accidental, and the Quill, which ran it verbatim in a special evening edition that Weatherwick had apparently been preparing to coincide with it. The Prophet ran it the next morning. Front page. Not because they were brave, but because by Friday morning they no longer had the option of being cowards. The story was too large and too documented, and too many people had read it in too many other places for the Prophet to pretend it wasn't happening without making themselves the story. The headline was careful and slightly mealy-mouthed, hedged with words like alleged and claimed, but it was there, on the front page, in the paper that every wizarding household in Britain received by owl. Sirius's letter arrived Friday afternoon. It was everything she'd asked for and more. He had clearly found legal counsel in the interval since Harry's first letter, because the statement was professionally constructed in a way that the earlier correspondence hadn't been, and it included a secondary statement from someone called Remus Lupin documenting a separate visit to Privet Drive in August 1991 during which he had noticed behavioral indicators in Harry consistent with low-grade compound exposure, which he had not fully understood at the time but which he now documented formally. She had not expected the second statement. She read it twice. It was, she thought, the most precise documentation they had of the timeline, an external witness with no stake in the outcome who had observed Harry before the school year and could describe what low-grade exposure looked like before any of them had known what they were looking at. She sent both statements to the inquiry office by urgent post. The Wizengamot called the formal inquiry on Monday. She found out the way most of the school found out, the morning papers, delivered by the mass arrival of owls that had become, in the 3 months in September, a feature of their daily routine. The formal inquiry notice was in both the Prophet and the Quill, and it cited the petition filed by Hermione Granger, student, Hogwarts, and it listed the terms of reference, which included an independent review of all documentation, witness testimony from confirmed victims, and authority to compel production of records from any named party. The any named party clause was the important one. It was the clause that would reach the farmhouse in Yorkshire. Harry read the paper across from her and set it down and looked at her and said, "You did it." "We did it," she said. "And it's not done yet." "No," he said. "But this part is." She thought about that. About what this part meant, the part where they were 4 first-years building a case in a school library, working by wandlight and borrowed owl post, filling notebooks and sending letters into the uncertain dark. That part had produced something. It had produced a formal Wizengamot inquiry and 61 confirmed victims and a named distributor and a petition on the front page of 2 newspapers. She ate her breakfast and thought about what came next. The inquiry met for the first time on a Thursday in late November. They were invited, this time. The formal invitation arrived on ministry parchment, signed by the Deputy Chief Warlock, and it invited Harry James Potter, Hermione Jean Granger, Neville Frank Longbottom, and Luna Xena Lovegood to attend as primary witnesses in the inquiry opening session. It was addressed to them by name, not by the students responsible for, and the distinction felt like a small and significant thing. Dumbledore arranged the travel. He did it without comment, which was its own kind of comment, the particular silence of someone who had made a private accounting of what they should have done and what they had done and had found the gap significant. He organized the flow, confirmed the times, and when Hermione came to his office to confirm the arrangements, he said, "You have done something remarkable, Miss Granger," in a tone that carried something heavier than simple acknowledgement. "We found what was there," she said. "Someone should have found it 30 years ago." He looked at her over his glasses. "Yes," he said. "They should have." She didn't say anything else. She went to get ready. The inquiry chamber was larger than the emergency hearing room in October, properly large, wood-paneled and formal, with a raised bench for the Wisengamot magistrates and a central floor that felt like standing in something that had been deciding things for a very long time. There were more people this time. Ministry officials, family solicitors, journalists in the public gallery, and across the room, seated with two legal representatives and looking, for the first time since Hermione had encountered her, not entirely composed, Narcissa Malfoy. Draco was not there. She looked for him and didn't find him, which was probably right. He was 11, he was at school, his mother was here, and his statement had been submitted in writing rather than in person because Hermione had suggested that when she'd spoken to him last. What she had not expected was who was seated 3 places down from Narcissa, separated by 2 strangers and looking absolutely nothing like she'd imagined based on the letters. Sirius Black was thin in the way of someone who had recently been much thinner, with a quality of barely controlled energy that she recognized from Harry's particular mode of stillness, the same genetic something, expressed in a different temperament. He caught Harry's eye from across the chamber and something passed between them that was too private to look at directly, and she looked away and found Neville looking at the floor with the expression of someone who had a complicated feeling about being in an official chamber where things were going to be said about what had been done to him. She put her hand briefly on his arm and said nothing. Luna was reading. Even here. She had a notebook open on her lap and was reviewing something, and Hermione had a feeling it was the red notebook, Ministry Connections, cross-referencing the magistrates against her records as they filed in. "Anything?" Hermione murmured. "Two I'd have concerns about," Luna murmured back. "But they're in the minority and the chair is clean." She turned a page. "We're fine." The session opened. The chief warlock, an elderly man named Tiberius Ogden who had the manner of someone who had seen most things and was not easily impressed and was, currently, paying extremely close attention, outlined the terms of reference and the scope of the inquiry. Hermione listened to every word and tracked it against what she'd read of Wisengamot procedural rules and a text she'd found in the restricted section, noting 2 places where Ogden's outline diverged from what she'd expected, both of which were expansions rather than contractions of scope, which told her something useful about where he stood. The documentation was entered into formal record. All of it, Luna's 4 notebooks, the restricted section historical analysis, Harry and Neville's statements, the physical evidence from the train wrappers, Snape's 3 pages, submitted anonymously as expert testimony from a qualified potions master, which Ogden had accepted without pressing on the identity, which was interesting, Narcissa's cooperative testimony, and Sirius's statement with Lupin's addendum. When the clerk finished reading the inventory into record, there was a silence in the chamber that had weight in it. Then the Selwyn family solicitor said, "The inquiry should note that a significant portion of this documentation was obtained by minors using methods that, the documentation was obtained using a library research pass, standard OWL post, voluntary testimony from consenting individuals, and a formal legal complaint submitted through the correct channels," Hermione said, clearly and without raising her voice. "If counsel wishes to argue that the problem is with how we found the evidence rather than with what the evidence describes, I think the chamber should hear that argument in full." The solicitor looked at her. Ogden looked at the solicitor. Ogden said, "Continue when you're ready, Mr. Hartley," in a tone that made clear he considered the objection unproductive, and Hartley did not continue. The session ran for 3 hours. Hermione spoke 4 times, twice when questioned directly by Ogden about documentation methodology, once to clarify a timeline discrepancy the inquiry counsel had identified, and once when a Parkinson representative made an argument about the relevance of the restricted section historical records that was factually incorrect and needed correcting. Harry spoke twice, both times with the same quiet, plain directness as his written account. Neville spoke once, and what he said was brief and specific, and when he finished the chamber was very quiet in the way that means what someone said is not in question and everyone in the room knows it. Luna spoke once, when the inquiry chemist asked a technical question about the Rosier compound signature that he had apparently expected would go unanswered. She answered it in 4 sentences that referenced specific page numbers in her appendix, and the chemist wrote down all 4 sentences. At the close of the first session, Ogden issued 3 interim orders. First, a preservation order on all records held by any named party, meaning nothing could be destroyed pending the inquiry's completion. Second, a warrant authorizing the inquiry's enforcement division to attend the premises in the North Riding of Yorkshire to seize and preserve any records held there, which was worded carefully enough that it named neither Row nor the farmhouse but was very clearly aimed at both. Third, an expanded list of families brought under formal investigation scope based on the documentation entered into record, bringing the total number of named families to 27. 27. She wrote it in her notebook. Beside the list of things she'd written on the first day of school and every day since, she wrote 27 families, formal inquiry scope, Wisingamot authority, preservation orders in effect, and underlined it 3 times. Then she wrote, Rose records, seized pending review. Full picture forthcoming. The walk out of the chamber was different from the walk in. Not because anything looked different, but because the air between things had changed, between her and the magistrates who had watched them, between the family representatives and their solicitors who had spent 3 hours discovering that the documentation was exactly as solid as the articles had claimed, between Harry walking on her right and Neville on her left and Luna slightly ahead reading as she walked, which was a habit Hermione found charming rather than concerning. In the corridor outside the chamber, Sirius Black appeared beside Harry and they stopped walking, and Hermione and Neville and Luna stopped too, though slightly apart, giving them a version of privacy in a public space. She watched Harry look at Sirius properly for the first time, really look, not the letter-mediated version. Sirius looked back, and whatever passed between them in that look was not something she had words for and didn't need words for. Sirius put his hand briefly on the back of Harry's neck in the gesture of someone claiming the right to look out for someone, and Harry let him, and it lasted about 3 seconds and that was enough. "You're going to be all right," Sirius said. "I know," Harry said, and the thing about how he said it was that he did, actually, know. It wasn't reassurance accepted. It was a person who had found their own footing and was confirming rather than believing. On the way back to the flue, they passed Narcissa in the corridor, coming the other way with her legal representatives. She stopped when she saw Hermione. Her representative stopped. Hermione stopped. They looked at each other. The corridor was stone and cold and impersonal, exactly the wrong setting for whatever this was, and neither of them seemed to find it relevant. "The Yorkshire warrant," Narcissa said. "That was yours." "The inquiries," Hermione said. "Based on evidence provided by several people." "But you knew about the Yorkshire operation." "I was told," Hermione said. "By someone who decided to help." Narcissa looked at her with that same precise, comprehensive look she'd had in the classroom, the one that catalogued and assessed and gave nothing back easily. She had given her testimony today in full. Hermione had read the submitted version the previous night, and it had been thorough and specific and more damaging to the 4 named families than she'd expected, which suggested that Narcissa had decided that if she was going to do this, she was going to do it properly. "What happens to the families you can't prove?" Narcissa said. "The ones with circumstantial evidence only. The ones where there's no physical trace and the victim can't or won't testify. The inquiry has to work with what exists," Hermione said. "Some families will avoid consequence because the evidence isn't there. That's how law is supposed to work, you need evidence." She paused. "But the practice is documented now. The existence of the network is public record. The families that avoid this inquiry will know that avoiding it doesn't mean it didn't happen and doesn't mean it won't be found eventually." She looked at her steadily. "The water changes." Narcissa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My son tells me you gave him somewhere to put something he'd been carrying for a long time." Hermione thought about the bench outside McGonagall's office. The parchment in both hands. I collected a list, she said. You gave him a door, Narcissa said. He hadn't had one. She walked on, and her representatives followed, and Hermione stood in a cold corridor and thought about what it meant to be a mother inside a system and know it was wrong and stay in it anyway, and what it cost, and what it eventually cost too much. She didn't have a clean answer. She thought she probably wouldn't, for a long time. Back at Hogwarts the castle felt different to her, or rather she felt different in it, the way the same room can feel different depending on what you've been doing before you walked in. She had been in a Wisengamot chamber. She had been in ministry corridors and emergency hearings and a potions professor's cold office at night. She had written 47 pages of evidence and a formal petition and more letters than she could count, and she had done it in 4 months at a school where she was technically supposed to be learning to turn matchsticks into needles. She thought about that, walking back through the entrance hall, and she felt not tired exactly, but the particular feeling of having used herself fully for something that mattered, which was different from tired and better than it. The great hall was empty, it was the wrong time of day for meals and most students were in class. Harry went to find Ron, who had been anxious all day about missing the trip and had asked twice for detailed updates by Owl. Neville went to the greenhouse, where she suspected he went when he needed quiet and growing things around him, which she understood better than it probably appeared. Luna said, "I'm going to write to my father," and disappeared in the direction of the Ollery. Hermione went to the library. She wasn't looking for anything specific. She had found, over the term, that the library was where she processed things, the smell of the paper, the organized proximity of information, the specific comfort of knowing that everything in this room had been thought through carefully enough to be written down. She found an empty table near the back and she sat down and opened her notebook and looked at it. What we know. 4 pages, dense. Every documented fact about the compulsion chemistry network, the families, the distribution structure, the suppression history. What we need to find. Most of it crossed out. Not all of it, there was one remaining item, circled, that she hadn't crossed out because it wasn't findable, exactly. It was more like a thing that would reveal itself over time. It said, where does the belief come from? Not the practice, the philosophy. The idea that children are assets to arrange. Where does that start and how do you change it? She looked at that item for a while. You could dismantle the network. You could prosecute the families. You could reform the laws and close the gaps and make it structurally harder to do what had been done. All of that was important and all of that was happening, to varying degrees, because of what they'd built over the last 4 months. But the belief was harder. The belief that certain people had the right to manage other people's relationships and feelings and choices because it was strategic, because it was efficient, because it had always been done this way and the families who benefited from it had always been the ones with the authority to decide what was acceptable. That belief didn't go away because a law changed. It went away because enough people said no, actually, that's not how people work, that's not what children are for, and we're going to say so loudly and specifically and for as long as it takes until saying it any other way is impossible. She was 11. She had 3.5 terms left in her first year, and 5 more years after that, and a life after that. She had time. She closed the notebook and leaned back in her chair and looked at the library shelves, which stretched up to the ceiling in the afternoon light, enormous and patient and full. She heard footsteps and Harry appeared around the corner of the stacks, which surprised her because she'd thought he'd gone to find Ron. "Ron's at practice," he said, by way of explanation. McGonagall let the Quidditch team use the pitch. He sat down across from her. Luna's owl is apparently refusing to cooperate. Neville is talking to a plant. The plant is probably listening, Hermione said. I told him that. Harry looked at her notebook. Are you all right? The question was simple and direct and she thought about it honestly. Yes, she said. I'm thinking about what's next. Of course you are, he said, without any edge, just the warmth of someone who had come to know her well enough to say it that way. There are still things we haven't gotten to, she said. The unnamed families in the inquiry's extended scope. The historical victims who are now adults, some of them might want formal redress and the law doesn't currently provide an adequate mechanism. And the philosophy of it, the cultural thing, the belief underneath the practice. That's a longer project. When isn't it, he said. She looked at him. He was sitting with his arms folded on the table, easy and relaxed, and he looked, she thought, like himself. She didn't have a precise comparison because she'd only known him 4 months, but she had the strong sense that what she was looking at was closer to whatever he would have been without 3 years of someone else's chemistry in his food. Decided. Clear-eyed. Comfortable in the space he took up. How do you feel? She said. He thought about it. Like things happened and I know they happened now. He paused. That sounds stupid. No, she said. It sounds like the difference between knowing something as an abstraction and knowing it as a fact you have to hold. Yeah, he said. That. He looked at the shelves. I keep thinking about the other ones. The 61. The ones we found and the ones we haven't found yet. Me too, she said. Some of them are going to take a long time to understand what happened to them, he said. The way Neville took a while. You can't just tell someone and have it land. No, she said. You can't. Are you going to do anything about that? In the inquiry process, I mean. Some kind of support structure. For the ones who find out. She had been thinking about this in a preliminary way and the fact that he was thinking about it too was not surprising but was good to know. I want to. I don't know what that looks like yet. Possibly working with Madame Pomfrey on a confidential consultation process. Possibly something more formal through the inquiry, a victim support mandate. She paused. But that needs people who are older and better qualified than me to design properly. My job is to make the case for why it needs to exist. You're good at that, he said. Making the case. I know, she said, without false modesty, which he'd come to expect from her and which she appreciated being able to do. He smiled. She picked up her quill. I want to start a file, she said. On the ongoing work. Not the investigation, that's the inquiry's job now. The other stuff. The legal reform side. The historical victims. The cultural argument. She opened to a fresh page. I'm going to call it The Next Beginning. Which I realize sounds grandiose. It sounds accurate, he said. She wrote the title at the top of the page. Underlined it. I'm also going to need access to the Hogwarts Founders Charter, she said. I found a reference to it in the restricted section records. There's a provision in the original governance documents about student welfare obligations that the board has never implemented because they've never been asked to, and I want to understand whether it has any applicability here. Harry looked at her. You found a welfare provision in the Founders' Charter. In a footnote, she said. Which is always where the important things are. He laughed. Of course it is. I'll need you and Neville for the welfare provision argument, she said. Because the provision is specifically about students whose physical or psychological well-being is affected by factors outside normal school oversight, which is exactly what this is, and having documented victims who are currently enrolled at the school makes the application much more direct. So we're bringing the Founders' Charter into this, Harry said. I'm starting to think the Founders' Charter into everything, she said. It's remarkably broad when you read it carefully. He shook his head, but he was smiling, and she went back to her notes, and the library was warm and quiet and smelled of old paper and possibility. Luna appeared around the stacks 5 minutes later with her notebook under her arm and sat down without preamble. My father's running a full retrospective in the Quibbler, she said. All 4 volumes. The complete documentation. He says Weatherwick is going to cross-reference it with the Quill Archive for a joint publication. Good, Hermione said. He also says the inquiry warrant was executed at the Yorkshire farmhouse this morning. Luna opened her notebook to the current page. Roe wasn't there. They found the records, approximately 300 files, going back 19 years, and they found enough in the first 15 minutes to triple the number of families under investigation scope. She looked at Hermione. There are names in those records that are going to be very significant. How do you know this already? Harry said. My father has a contact in the Inquiry Enforcement Division, Luna said. Of course he does, Harry said. Neville arrived 2 minutes later, brushing soil off his robes with an expression that had settled into something clear and purposeful, the look he'd been developing since October, the one that was becoming more natural on his face the longer it was there. What did I miss? He said. Rowe's records were seized, Hermione said. 300 files, 19 years. Triple the current investigation scope. Neville sat down and looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, good. Just that. Good. And it meant everything it needed to mean. The four of them sat in the library in the late afternoon light, notebooks and parchment between them, the particular comfortable quiet of people who have been through something together and found themselves on the other side of it still intact. Outside the windows the grounds were November gray and the lake was silver and the mountains beyond the castle were dark and enormous against the sky. Hermione looked at the notebook page. The next beginning. Below it, a list already starting to form, the welfare provision, the historical victims, the legal reform gaps, the cultural argument that didn't have a clear endpoint but needed making anyway. Someone asked me what's next, she said. Harry looked at her. Why? Because I want to say it out loud, she said. In front of people. To make it real. He smiled. He leaned back in his chair and folded his arms and said, all right. What's next, Hermione? She looked at the list. The inquiry was running. 27 families under formal scope, 300 files of records being processed in an enforcement division that had been independently staffed and was watched by enough public attention now that making things disappear would be visible rather than invisible. Narcissa Malfoy's testimony was in the official record. Draco Malfoy's list of 9 names had added 3 confirmed victims to the documentation. Thaddeus Rowe's distribution network was exposed, his insurance policy seized and turned against the system it had been designed to protect. The practice that had been done to 61 documented children over 4 months, and to uncountable others over the prior century, was on the front page of 2 newspapers and under formal Wisengamot authority and in the public record in a form that could not be buried again. They were 4 first-years sitting by a window in a school library in November. The welfare provision first, she said. Then the historical victims redress mechanism. Then the cultural argument, which is going to take a long time and I want to start building the framework for it now so when we're older and have more institutional access, the groundwork is already there. She paused. And we keep watching the inquiry. Every week. Every development. We make sure the independence holds and the families with deep pockets don't find a way to slow-walk it into irrelevance. Obviously, Harry said. Obviously, Neville agreed. Luna wrote something in her notebook. What are you writing? Harry said. A list, Luna said. Of things we haven't thought of yet that we'll probably need. You can't list things you haven't thought of, Ron said, appearing from around the stacks with 3 books and an expression of mild indignation at having been left out of whatever was happening. How did you all end up in the library? I've been looking everywhere. We were here, Hermione said. Harry told me, Ron said, sitting down and dumping the books on the table. He said something happened with a warrant and some records and there's a new list of names. There is, she said. Right. He looked around the table. So what are we doing about it? She looked at the notebook. She looked at the 4 of them, Harry with that particular steady attention, Neville straight-backed and sure, Luna already 3 pages into something, Ron with his elbows on the table and his whole uncomplicated willingness pointed in their direction. 4 first years. A library. A notebook that had started with what we know and was now opening onto something much larger than what they'd started with. We're starting the next part, she said. She picked up her quill. Outside, the November light was fading over the mountains and the lake, and the castle was settling into evening around them, old and enormous and full of everything they hadn't yet found. Somewhere in the inquiry offices in London, 300 files were being opened one at a time by investigators who were not compromised and were not looking away, and each file was a name and a date and a transaction that had, until this week, existed in perfect darkness. The dark was getting smaller. Hermione wrote the first item on the new list, pressed hard enough with the quill that the ink went clean and permanent into the page, and felt, not triumph, nothing so simple, but the clear-eyed, fully awake feeling of someone at the beginning of something that mattered, with good people beside her and more work ahead than she could see the end of, and the complete and absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She wrote, "Start here." Then she wrote, "Don't stop."